It was one of those late nights when I'd lost track of time working on a project at home. The clock blinked past 2 a.m., and I figured I'd just finish up a few more details before finally heading to bed. I had a small lamp on my desk, an old one I'd inherited from my grandmother. It had a warm glow and this delicate glass shade that I'd always liked, and though the wiring was a bit ancient, I hadn't given it much thought. It had worked just fine for years until that night. As I leaned over to reach something on the desk, my arm brushed against the lamp's cord, and suddenly, I felt a sharp sting, like the snap of static electricity but stronger. I jerked my arm back, staring at the lamp in confusion. At first, I thought it was just my imagination or a little zap from the dry winter air, but the skin on my arm prickled with a strange, lingering sensation that didn't feel quite right. Curious and more than a little uneasy, I unplugged the lamp and carefully looked at the cord. That's when I noticed a spot near the base that looked frayed, the protective rubber coating worn thin and peeling. I never noticed it before, but it was clear that the wires inside had been exposed. I felt a chill run through me, realizing how easily I could have been hurt if I'd grabbed the cord directly or if it had sparked against something on my desk. It wasn't a big shock, but it was enough to shake me up, enough to make me realize how much I'd taken the safety of that old lamp for granted. I'd always assumed that because it was small and familiar, it was harmless. But in reality, the wiring was outdated and brittle, the kind of hazard that could easily lead to an electrical fire if left unchecked. The next morning, I replaced the lamp with a new one, feeling strangely sad to see it go. But that incident made me realize that I'd been ignoring similar risks around my apartment. I started inspecting all the cords and outlets, looking for frayed edges or loose plugs that I might have otherwise brushed off. I found a few other culprits: a charger with exposed wires near the end, an extension cord that felt warm to the touch when I unplugged it. Small things that, on their own, seemed like minor annoyances, but that could easily become something far worse. The experience also got me thinking about an incident my friend Sam had gone through. He'd been plugging in a phone charger at a coffee shop when he noticed a spark from the outlet. At first, he thought it was just a faulty plug, but it turned out that the outlet had been overloaded for days, slowly melting from the inside. He didn't think much of it until the staff later told him that it had nearly caused a fire. That tiny spark had been the warning sign, one he'd almost ignored. Since then, I've developed a sort of ritual around checking the safety of the small things I once took for granted. I started inspecting the cords on my kitchen appliances, moving anything flammable away from outlets, even making sure I don't overload power strips. It sounds obsessive, but after that night with the lamp, I couldn't shake the feeling that these small precautions were worth it. These days, every time I plug something in, I think about that little shock, that reminder from a frayed cord in the quiet of my apartment. It's a reminder that even the things we find most familiar can hide risks, that even a small shock can be a warning to pay attention. And so I do. I unplug things when I'm not using them, keep an eye on the condition of my cords, and make a habit of checking outlets for any signs of wear. It's not just about preventing accidents. It's about respecting the unseen hazards that we so often overlook, about staying aware of the small details that make our homes both comfortable and hopefully safe. And in that way, that little shock turned into something more, a reminder to treat even the most familiar things with care, because sometimes the smallest dangers can have the biggest impact. This happened last winter, and even now, I can't walk into a dark room without feeling that same sense of dread creeping up my spine. I'd found a cheap sublet on the outskirts of town, an old 2-story house that was far too big for just me, but the price was right. The ad said it was quaint and historic, which I took as code for creepy and outdated, but I didn't mind. I needed the space to focus on my writing, and the isolation sounded perfect. No distractions, no neighbors, just me and a bit of quiet. The landlord mentioned in passing that the last tenant had left suddenly, but he brushed it off as a personal issue and assured me the place was fine. I should have taken that as a warning, but I was too excited to care. The first few days were uneventful. The house was drafty, with floors that creaked no matter how lightly I stepped, and it always seemed a few degrees colder than it should have been. The plumbing groaned and shuddered whenever I turned on the tap, and at night, the silence felt thick, like the house was holding its breath. On the third night, I was reading in bed when I heard something strange. It was faint, barely audible at first, a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere inside the walls. I brushed it off as an old house settling, telling myself it was probably just the pipes or maybe a tree branch brushing against the siding. But as the night went on, the tapping grew louder, almost insistent, like someone knocking, steady and deliberate. I got up, wandering the house with a flashlight, trying to find the source of the sound. It seemed to come from different spots each time I got close, from the walls, the ceiling, sometimes even the floor. I told myself it was my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next night, the tapping started again, right around midnight, echoing through the walls. This time, though, there was something else, a faint, muffled whisper, almost too quiet to hear, as if someone was speaking from far away, just beyond the walls. I pressed my ear to the wall, straining to listen, but I couldn't make out any words. It was just a low, repetitive murmur, a voice rising and falling in a steady rhythm, speaking too softly for me to understand. A chill ran through me, but I forced myself to laugh it off. Old houses make weird noises, I told myself. No big deal. But the noises didn't stop. Each night, right around midnight, I'd hear the same tapping, the same whispering, always from a different part of the house, like it was moving, searching for something. I started dreading nighttime, lying awake in bed, listening to the sounds, heart pounding, wondering if I'd finally lost my mind. One night, around 2 a.m, I decided I'd had enough. I grabbed my flashlight and stormed through the house, determined to find the source. The tapping was louder now, coming from somewhere downstairs, echoing up through the floorboards. I followed it to the living room, standing in the middle of the dark room, shining my light around, feeling more foolish by the second. That's when I noticed something strange. The floorboards in the corner of the room, near the old, dusty fireplace, looked different. The wood was darker, slightly warped, like it had been pried up and put back down again. I don't know what possessed me to check, but I found a crowbar in the garage and started prying up the boards. As soon as I lifted the first board, the smell hit me. It was a thick, musty odor like mold and rot, the kind of smell that settles in the back of your throat. I gagged but kept going, pulling up the boards one by one until there was a dark hole in the floor, a narrow crawl space leading down into the pitch black. I shone my flashlight into the hole, and what I saw made my skin crawl. There was something down there, buried under the floorboards. Old, yellowed bones, tangled in torn scraps of fabric, lying in a shallow grave. I backed away, heart pounding, while rising in my throat. I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing, couldn't believe it was real. But before I could even process it, I heard it again, the tapping. But this time, it was coming from directly behind me. I spun around, shining my flashlight, but the room was empty. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate, coming closer, each tap echoing in the silence. I felt a chill run through me as I realized it wasn't coming from the walls anymore. It was coming from the doorway, as if someone or something was standing there tapping softly on the wood. Then I heard the whisper, closer now, clearer than it had ever been before. A single word, repeated over and over, barely louder than a breath. Help, help, help. I stumbled back, tripping over the hole in the floor, falling to the ground, the flashlight slipping from my hand. I scrambled to my feet, heart racing, and ran for the door, not daring to look back. I didn't stop until I was outside, slamming the front door behind me, gasping for air, my hands shaking. I called the landlord, barely able to get the words out, told him about what I'd found. He was silent for a long time, and then he sighed, sounding almost relieved. I figured it'd come up sooner or later, he said quietly. The last tenant, she was a quiet woman, kept to herself. One night, she just disappeared. Never paid her last month's rent. I thought she'd skip town, but I always had a feeling. I didn't wait for him to finish. I hung up, got into my car, and drove to a motel on the edge of town. I didn't sleep that night, lying in bed with the lights on, listening for any sound, terrified that the tapping would start again. The next morning, I went back to get my things, desperate to get out of that house. But as I was packing, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the wall by the bed, faint but unmistakable, were scratches. Long, jagged lines like someone had clawed at the wall, over and over, desperate to get out. And beneath the scratches, written in faint, spidery letters, was a single word. Help! I left that day, breaking the lease, losing my deposit, not caring about the money. I just wanted to get as far away as possible. But even now, months later, I still hear it sometimes, just as I'm drifting off to sleep. A faint rhythmic tapping, followed by that same desperate whisper. Help, help! And every time, I wonder if it's trying to follow me, if it's still searching, still waiting for someone to hear it. It was one of those nights when the air was thick with fog, blanketing everything in an eerie, muffled silence. I was on my way back from a friend's place in the countryside, taking the old road that wound through the hills and farmland. It was pitch black, the kind of dark where even high beams barely cut through, and the only sound was the low hum of my car engine. I'd been driving for about 20 minutes, feeling that sense of isolation that only hits when you're far from anyone else, alone in the dark. I was coming around a bend when, out of nowhere, my headlights caught something on the side of the road, a shape just barely visible in the fog. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a stray dog. But as I got closer, I realized it was a person. They were standing perfectly still, almost statue-like, wrapped in an old coat that looked out of place, the kind of clothing you'd see in old photos. I slowed down, my curiosity getting the better of me, and as I passed, I caught a glimpse of their face. It was a man with hollow, sunken eyes and skin as pale as the fog around him. He looked at me as I passed, his eyes locking onto mine in the headlights, and for a moment, I felt a chill crawl down my spine. His gaze was blank, unblinking, but there was something in his eyes, something distant and haunting, like he was looking right through me. I sped up, trying to shake off the feeling, telling myself he was probably just a wanderer, maybe someone lost or looking for a ride. But as I continued down the road, a feeling of unease settled over me, the quiet of the night pressing in. About a mile later, I saw him again, standing by the side of the road, just like before. Same coat, same empty gaze, his figure barely visible in the fog. My stomach dropped, and my hands gripped the wheel tighter as I sped past, glancing in the mirror to see if he was still there. But the road behind me was empty, swallowed by the fog. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, that it couldn't have been the same man. But a few minutes later, as I rounded another curve, there he was again, standing closer to the road this time, his face turned toward me, his eyes catching the light in a way that made them look almost hollow. I didn't slow down this time. I kept my foot on the gas, my heart racing as I tried to put as much distance as possible between me and that figure. The road stretched out endlessly, the fog growing thicker, wrapping around my car like a cocoon. I kept glancing in the mirror, half expecting to see him standing in the road behind me. And then, just as I thought I'd lost him, I saw movement up ahead. This time, he was standing in the middle of the road, directly in my path. His face was pale, expressionless, his eyes fixed on me as if he'd been waiting. I slammed on the brakes, my car skidding to a stop just a few feet away from him. My headlights illuminated his face, casting strange shadows that made his features seem almost skeletal. I sat there, frozen, staring at him through the windshield, my mind racing. He didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there, his gaze piercing and unrelenting. I wanted to back up, to get away, but my hands felt glued to the wheel, my body paralyzed by some primal fear I couldn't explain. And then, slowly, he raised his hand. He pointed down the road, his fingers stretching into the darkness, as if showing me something I couldn't see. I followed his gaze, but there was nothing there, just the empty road and the fog swirling in the headlights. When I looked back, he was gone. The road was empty, as if he'd never been there at all. My heart was pounding, my hands shaking as I sat there, trying to make sense of what had just happened. After a few moments, I took a deep breath, telling myself it was just exhaustion, that I was imagining things. But as I started driving again, a strange feeling settled over me, a sense that something was waiting for me up ahead. The fog thickened, and the road seemed to stretch on forever, the darkness pressing in from all sides. I kept my eyes on the road, gripping the wheel, determined not to look back. But as I drove, I felt a presence beside me, a coldness in the air, like someone was sitting in the passenger seat, watching me in silence. I glanced over, half expecting to see him there, but the seat was empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that he was there in the shadows, watching, waiting. I don't remember the rest of the drive. It was like a dream, a blur of fog and darkness, the road stretching on and on with no end in sight. By the time I reached the lights of the next town, my hands were numb, my mind hazy with exhaustion and fear. I pulled into a gas station, stumbling out of the car, the night air cold and biting. The attendant gave me a strange look as I walked in, asking if I was all right, and I forced a laugh, brushing it off as nothing. But as I turned to leave, I glanced back at my car, and there, on the fogged-up window of the passenger side, was a handprint. Pale, skeletal, pressed against the glass from the inside. I left that town as soon as I could, taking the long way home, far from that foggy road. And even now, months later, I can still feel his gaze on me, still see his hand pointing into the darkness, as if he's waiting for me to come back, to take that road one last time. My friend Maya had been saving up for a solo trip for years, the kind of dream adventure she'd been planning since college. She finally had the money, the itinerary, everything lined up. She booked a cheap flight with a budget airline, and a few days before the trip, she got an email saying her flight was canceled. No explanation, just a generic apology and an option to rebook at twice the price. She spent hours on the phone, only to get passed from agent to agent, all of whom told her they couldn't do anything. When she finally managed to rebook, the entire trip cost way more than she'd budgeted, but she tried to laugh it off. "It's like they're holding your plans hostage," she said, rolling her eyes. "Want to see the world? You pay their price, no questions asked." The same week, my buddy Nick was dealing with his own frustration. He'd been waiting months to see his favorite basketball team play live. He'd watched every game, followed every update, and was finally ready to get his hands on tickets. But within seconds, every ticket was gone, scooped up by bots and scalpers who resold them at prices no normal fan could afford. "It's like they don't care about real fans," he told me, his voice tight with disappointment. "They're just selling dreams to whoever has the deepest pockets." A few nights later, Maya, Nick, and I met up for drinks to commiserate. Maya was still reeling from the hit to her travel budget, and Nick kept shaking his head every time he thought about the ticket prices. As we sat there venting, our friend Zoe joined us, carrying her own frustration. Zoe works in tech, and she's always been excited about innovation. But lately, her job had started making her uneasy. "You have no idea how much data companies are collecting on people," she said, lowering her voice like she was sharing a scandalous secret. "Every click, every swipe, even how long you stare at certain posts. They're tracking it all and selling it to anyone who'll pay." We stared at her, realizing that the phones in our pockets were more like tracking devices than we'd ever considered. Zoe went on, explaining how the data wasn't just for improving user experience, as they like to say. It was about profit, about squeezing every last drop of information they could turn into money. "Privacy's basically dead," she said, her voice almost a whisper. And it was chilling to think of how much of ourselves was out there, for sale without us even knowing. Then, as if we needed more to feel powerless about, a news alert popped up on Nick's phone. It was yet another scandal involving politicians trading stocks on insider information. Apparently, some of them had sold off shares just before a big company lost half its value. They protected themselves while everyone else lost money. So they get to make the rules, break them whenever they want, and walk away richer? Nick muttered, shaking his head. "If any of us tried that, we'd be ruined." On our way out of the bar, we walked past a massive billboard advertising a new online casino. It showed a guy holding up a fistful of cash, his face lit up like he'd just won the lottery. "They make it look like winning is guaranteed," Maya scoffed. She told us about her cousin who'd recently fallen into online gambling, thinking he'd make a little extra money on the side. But instead, he'd ended up deep in debt, scrambling to get out. It's like they're preying on people's worst moments, making them think the next win is always around the corner. We left the bar feeling weighed down, as if the world had become a giant machine designed to drain us, piece by piece. Our money, our dreams, our data. Nothing felt safe from the reach of those who had the power and the means to manipulate it all. As we walked down the street, Zoe shook her head, saying it's like every part of our lives is just a product to them. None of us said anything, but deep down, we all knew she was right. I was closing up the bookstore for the night when I noticed a small leather-bound book lying on the counter, one I didn't remember shelving. It had no title, no author, just an old, weathered cover with a faint, embossed design of an hourglass. It looked like it had been there forever, yet I knew every book in the store, and I was certain this wasn't one of them. Curious, I picked it up, feeling the weight of it in my hands. The pages were thick and slightly yellowed, and as I flipped through, I realized they were all blank, except for the very first page. There, in neat, spidery handwriting, were 4 words: "To remember, start reading." I stood there, puzzled, glancing around the empty store as if someone might pop out and explain the prank. But there was only silence, just the soft hum of the lights and the faint rustling of a stray breeze coming in through the cracked window. A strange urge settled over me, a curiosity that bordered on compulsion. So, I sat down, flipped back to the first page, and began to read. As soon as my eyes scanned the first line, words appeared, forming sentences before my eyes, as if the book were writing itself in real time. I watched, spellbound, as the story unfolded. On a warm autumn evening, a boy named Elias walked through the woods, searching for a memory he'd left behind. Elias. That was my middle name, but that wasn't the strangest part. The scene it described was painfully familiar. I remembered it, though it had happened years ago. I was barely 8, wandering through the woods behind my grandparents' house, chasing after something, or maybe running away. I hadn't thought about that night in ages, but here it was, written in this mysterious book as if it had been waiting for me to remember. I kept reading, feeling that same eerie recognition with each line. The book knew things about me, things I hadn't thought about in years, some memories so distant I wasn't sure they'd even happened. Each page filled with moments from my life, almost like someone had written down my memories without my knowing. One memory in particular stopped me cold. It was about the night my mother had taken me stargazing, the last night I'd seen her before she'd passed away. She'd taken me to a clearing in the woods, wrapping me in a thick blanket and pointing out constellations, her voice soft and full of wonder. I'd been so young, but I remembered her words, how she'd told me that we're all made of stardust, that even when we're gone, we leave a bit of ourselves behind. My eyes blurred, the room feeling suddenly colder as the book continued, filling in the details I hadn't recalled in years. My mother's laugh, the way her hand felt against mine, the scent of lavender she always wore. I felt like I was there again, wrapped in that blanket under a sky full of stars, feeling her warmth beside me. I wiped my eyes, shaken, but I couldn't stop reading. Page after page, the book unfolded more memories, each more vivid than the last. Like pieces of my life I'd left behind were coming back to me all at once. And then, near the end of the book, the pages changed. The memory described wasn't one I recognized, at least not at first. It spoke of a hidden door, one that I'd always sensed was there, but had never found. A door that, according to the book, could only be seen by those who remembered what they'd forgotten. I read the line again, my mind racing. A hidden door? I'd never seen anything like that in the bookstore, but I felt a strange certainty growing inside me, like the book was guiding me towards something important. Following some instinct I couldn't explain, I stood up and walked toward the back of the store, my footsteps soft on the creaking wooden floor. There, near the old history section, I stopped, staring at a corner I'd passed countless times, but never looked at closely. The wall seemed solid, ordinary, but now I felt a pull, as if something was waiting just on the other side. I reached out, pressing my hand against the wall, and to my astonishment, it gave way, sliding aside to reveal a narrow passage lit by a faint, silvery glow. Heart pounding, I stepped through, finding myself in a small room, empty except for a single chair and a tall, arched mirror. The mirror was old, its frame ornate and tarnished, and as I approached, the glow grew brighter, illuminating the room in a soft, otherworldly light. I looked into the mirror, expecting to see my reflection, but instead, I saw something else. A younger version of myself, no older than 10, standing beside my mother in that same starlit clearing. She was smiling down at me, her face warm and full of love, as if she'd been waiting here all along. I felt a strange, aching joy as I watched her, memories flooding back in a wave. All the moments we'd shared, the things I'd forgotten, the warmth of her presence. I didn't know if it was real, if this mirror was showing me a memory or something more. But in that moment, I didn't care. I reached out, my fingers hovering just above the glass, feeling a warmth radiating from it. And then, faintly, I heard her voice, as clear as if she were standing beside me. "Elias," she whispered, using my middle name the way she always had. "I'm so proud of you. You found your way." Tears filled my eyes, but I smiled, feeling a peace I hadn't known in years. It was as if all the grief, all the emptiness I'd carried, had lifted, replaced by a quiet understanding. "I miss you," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The mirror shimmered, her image softening, her smile lingering as the light faded. "I'm always with you," her voice echoed, fading like the last note of a song. I stayed there, staring at the mirror long after her image had faded, feeling a warmth in my chest, a sense of closure I hadn't thought possible. Finally, I turned and walked back through the hidden door, finding myself back in the bookstore, the leather-bound book resting on the counter where I'd left it. But now, the pages were blank, as if the memories had been returned to me, leaving the book empty, its purpose fulfilled. I closed it gently, feeling a deep gratitude, a sense that I'd been given a gift, a chance to remember, to reconnect with a part of myself I'd thought I'd lost. I took the book home that night, placing it on my shelf, knowing it would remain a reminder of that night, of the door I'd found, and the mother I'd never truly lost. And every now and then, when I needed to remember, I'd take it down, open its pages, and feel her presence like stardust in the air, forever guiding me home. I've been a paramedic for almost 15 years now, working the night shift in a city that doesn't sleep. I've seen a lot, stuff that most people only see in movies and things I wish I could forget. But a few months back, I got called to something I can't shake, no matter how hard I try. It was close to 3 a.m. on a Tuesday, and the call came in as an unresponsive female, possible overdose. Pretty standard for that time of night. We pulled up to an old apartment complex, the kind that's been around for decades, with cracked paint and narrow, dimly lit hallways that always seemed to echo. I've been to hundreds of places like it, but there was something about this one that felt heavier. A neighbor met us in the hallway, wringing her hands. She looked exhausted and scared, her eyes darting to the door and then back at us. "She's just lying there," she whispered, almost as if she didn't want anyone else to hear. "She's been in there for days, I think." My partner and I exchanged a look. Days was unusual. When people get found like this, it's usually a matter of hours. Days meant we could be walking into anything. We knocked, announced ourselves, and when there was no answer, we pushed the door open. The apartment was dark, the air thick and stale, with an overpowering metallic smell that only got stronger the further we went inside. We turned on our flashlights and scanned the room. She was in the living room, slumped against the wall, head down, hair falling over her face. I knelt beside her, feeling for a pulse, expecting the worst. But then, I felt a faint, weak beat under my fingers. "Hey," I said gently, trying to rouse her. "Can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered, but she didn't fully wake. Her skin was cold and clammy, her breathing shallow, but there were no signs of drugs, no needles, no pill bottles. Nothing that would explain why she was in this state. We checked her over quickly and decided to load her up, thinking she might need fluids or maybe had been hypothermic. Whatever it was, she needed to be seen at the hospital fast. As we lifted her onto the stretcher, her head lolled to the side, and for a moment, I saw her eyes open, just a slit. They were bloodshot, unfocused, but there was something there, A flicker of awareness, a look that I can only describe as terror. She reached up, her fingers brushing against my arm, and whispered, "Don't let them in." I froze for a second, caught off guard. "Who?" I asked, but she'd already drifted back, her hand falling limp. We got her into the ambulance, and on the ride to the hospital, I kept replaying her words in my head. It wasn't unusual for people to say strange things when they were coming in and out of consciousness, but the way she'd said it, the look in her eyes, it felt different. Once we got to the ER, we handed her off, briefing the nurses on what little we knew, and moved on to our next call. The night went on, but something about her stayed with me. "Don't let them in." It gnawed at me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her story, that we'd left something unfinished. The next night, just after midnight, I was back on shift when we got another call to the same apartment building. Unresponsive male, early 30s, in the same unit. I remember pausing for a second, feeling this cold weight settle over me. Calls don't usually come in back-to-back like that, especially not in the same apartment. We arrived, and the building felt different, almost like it was holding its breath. The lights in the hallway flickered as we walked down to her unit. The door was ajar, just slightly, like someone had left in a hurry and hadn't bothered to close it. Inside, it was the same oppressive darkness, the same metallic smell lingering in the air. My flashlight caught a figure in the corner, another man this time, lying on his side, unmoving. He was dressed in jeans and a t-shirt, no signs of drugs or alcohol, just lying there like he'd simply stopped. I knelt down and checked for a pulse. There was faint but steady. I was about to call out to my partner when I felt something, a slight pressure on my wrist. I looked down, and his eyes were open, staring straight at me, wide and frantic. He struggled to breathe, his chest heaving, and with a voice full of desperation, he rasped, "Did she say anything?" I blinked, taken aback. "Who?" I asked, confused. "The woman," he said, his grip tightening. "Did she say anything?" I hesitated, and then nodded. "Yes," she said. "Don't let them in." He closed his eyes, exhaling shakily, his face pale as a sheet. "They're already here," he whispered. I tried, but they got in. He wouldn't say anything else, and after a minute, he slipped into unconsciousness. We got him to the hospital, and he was admitted for observation. But just like the woman, he vanished without a trace a few hours later. Walked out of the hospital barefoot in the middle of the night, and no one could explain how he'd managed to leave undetected. Since then, I can't stop thinking about that apartment, about those words, "Don't let them in." I asked around, talked to the police who handled the case, but there was nothing to go on. No records, no history of anything unusual at that address. Just an old building filled with people trying to get by. But every time I drive by it now, I get this uneasy feeling like something's waiting there, hidden behind those walls, just out of sight. I don't know who or what they are, and maybe I never will. But whatever it was, it found them, and the fear in their eyes, it stayed with me, like a shadow I can't escape. It was a quiet Sunday morning, and I was finally getting around to some long overdue cleaning in my kitchen. I'd pulled everything out from under the sink, determined to tackle the dust and clutter that had piled up over time. As I cleared out bottles of half-used cleaners and old sponges, I noticed a few patches of discoloration on the back wall of the cabinet. Curious, I reached out to touch it, only to find that the wood was damp. A little spark of anxiety flickered through me. There was no reason for it to be wet. I hadn't had any leaks, and I couldn't remember spilling anything down there. I pushed around some of the items, and that's when I spotted it, a small, slow drip coming from the pipe under the sink. It was barely noticeable, a tiny drop every few seconds, but it had clearly been leaking for a while. The damp wood was beginning to warp, and a faint smell of mildew hung in the air, something I hadn't noticed until I got up close. I crouched down, examining the pipe, and noticed a tiny hairline crack along its side, right near the joint. It was subtle, easy to miss, but enough to let water seep out slowly and steadily. The realization hit me like a cold wave. If I hadn't noticed it now, that small leak could have grown worse, flooding the cabinet, damaging the wood, and maybe even leaking through the floor. I grabbed a bowl to catch the drip and called a plumber. As I waited, I couldn't help but think about how close I'd come to letting this small, hidden problem turn into something much bigger. It made me think about how often we ignore these tiny signs of trouble, assuming that because they're out of sight, they're also out of mind. I'd been shoving things under the sink for months, maybe even years, without noticing what was right in front of me. The plumber arrived later that afternoon. After inspecting the pipe, he explained that the joint had probably loosened over time, maybe from temperature changes or just old age. He replaced the damaged section, tightening everything up and double-checking for other weak spots. As he packed up, he said something that stuck with me. These small leaks are often the ones that get people. You don't notice them until they've already done damage. His words stayed with me long after he left. I started noticing all the other small leaks around my home. The things I'd let sit for too long, the minor issues I'd ignored because they didn't seem urgent. I fixed the loose railing on my balcony, checked the grout in my bathroom tiles, and tightened up the screws on my bookshelves. Each little fix felt like a small victory, a way to stay ahead of the small problems before they turned into big ones. A week or so later, I shared the story with my friend Jess, who had just moved into an older apartment herself. She laughed at first, but then admitted she'd noticed a similar damp spot on her own sink. "I kept thinking I'd check it out eventually," she said, sounding a bit sheepish. "But maybe eventually should be today." Sure enough, she called me later that night, saying she'd found a small leak in her kitchen too. She thanked me for nudging her to take a closer look, and I felt a strange sense of satisfaction, knowing I'd helped someone else avoid the same near miss. Since then, I've made it a habit to check under the sink regularly, to stay mindful of the small, hidden risks that so often escape our notice. It's a small routine, just a quick glance here and there, but it gives me peace of mind. I've come to realize that it's not just the big, obvious problems we need to watch out for. It's the tiny, barely there ones, the slow leaks and quiet creaks that seem harmless until they're not. Now, every time I open that cabinet, I remember the faint drip of that tiny leak, the one I almost missed. It's a reminder that even in the places we think we know best, there are always hidden things worth looking for, small issues that, left alone, can grow into something much larger. And in that way, I've learned that paying attention to the little things can be one of the best ways to protect the things and places we care about most. I still don't understand what happened last autumn, and honestly, I'm not sure I want to. I was working for a property management company, handling the upkeep on rental houses and vacation homes in this small, lakeside town. Most of the work was routine, basic maintenance, checking in between tenants, making sure the places stayed clean. I'd been at it for a few years, and I thought I'd seen just about everything a house could throw at you. But then I got sent to a place I hadn't seen before. It was a small cabin at the edge of the lake, secluded, barely visible from the road, and surrounded by trees. It wasn't listed as a rental. More like an old family property the company managed as a favor to the owner. They only called me because it had been sitting empty for a long time and needed a good cleaning and a few minor repairs. The place had been rented out once or twice over the years, but mostly it just sat there untouched, collecting dust. My manager told me to check it over, make sure everything was functional, and get it ready in case the owner wanted to sell. When I arrived, it was late in the afternoon, the sun low over the water. The cabin had a dark, weathered look, like it had been there forever. The windows were grimy, the paint was peeling, and there was this feeling in the air, something heavy and still. It was the kind of place that felt like it was waiting for something. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, the floor creaking under my weight. The air was stale, filled with that smell of dust and damp wood that comes from years of being closed up. The cabin was small, just a living room, a tiny kitchen, a single bedroom, and a bathroom. There were a few old pieces of furniture covered in sheets, and the walls were lined with faded photographs, black and white snapshots of people I assumed were long-gone family members. I took out my supplies, started dusting, sweeping, cleaning the windows. As I worked, I kept noticing these odd details. The way the photographs all seemed to be arranged to face the front door, the single rocking chair placed in the corner of the room, angled just so like someone had been sitting there watching. Every few minutes, I'd look over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone there, but it was always just me and the quiet, empty room. About an hour in, I went to the kitchen to check the plumbing, running the water to make sure the pipes weren't clogged. As I did, I noticed something strange. The water ran dark for a moment, rusty, almost like blood. I let it run a few seconds, and eventually it cleared up, but the sight of that reddish water stuck with me. By the time I finished in the kitchen, it was starting to get dark outside, so I turned on a couple of lamps and moved on to the bedroom. The walls in there were bare, except for a single painting, a strange, shadowy forest scene, the trees twisted and close together, barely any light between them. Something about the painting made me feel uneasy, like there was something hidden in the shadows, something just out of sight. The bed was unmade, the sheets dusty, so I stripped it down and put on fresh linens. As I was tucking the sheets in, I heard a noise, a soft, creaking sound, like someone shifting their weight on old floorboards. I froze, listening. The sound seemed to come from the living room, just outside the bedroom door. I stood there, every instinct telling me to stay quiet, to listen. But after a few seconds, there was only silence. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just the cabin settling, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I went back into the living room, where the air felt colder, heavier. The floor creaked again, and this time, I was sure it wasn't my imagination. I looked around, scanning the room, and that's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before, a small, wooden trapdoor in the corner, barely visible under the edge of an old rug. I felt a wave of dread wash over me, a voice in the back of my mind telling me to leave, to forget about it. But I couldn't. I had to know. I moved the rug aside, grabbed the handle, and pulled. The trapdoor creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into the dark. I didn't have a flashlight, just my phone, so I turned on the flashlight app and aimed it down the stairs. The light barely reached the bottom, but I could see the faint outline of a small room below, the walls lined with shelves. I took a deep breath, telling myself it was probably just a storage space, maybe a cellar. But as I stepped down, one creaky step after another, I noticed something strange. There were scratch marks on the walls, deep grooves, like someone had clawed at the plaster, desperate to get out. At the bottom of the stairs, I found myself in a small, windowless room. The shelves were lined with jars, dozens of them, filled with strange, murky liquids and unidentifiable objects floating inside. I felt my stomach twist as I looked closer, recognizing bits of bone, teeth, small fragments of things that shouldn't have been there. And then, on the far wall, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a name, scratched into the plaster, repeated over and over in frantic, uneven letters, Sarah. I backed away, my heart racing, and that's when I heard it, the soft, rhythmic creaking of the rocking chair upstairs. It was slow, deliberate, as if someone was sitting in it, rocking back and forth, back and forth. I turned and ran up the stairs, not daring to look back. When I reached the living room, I saw the chair moving, rocking gently, though there was no one in it. The front door was still open, so I bolted outside, my hands shaking as I fumbled to lock up behind me. As I stepped back, trying to catch my breath, I saw a movement in the window, a dark shape, just barely visible behind the glass, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I turned and got to my truck, not looking back, and drove away as fast as I could, my heart racing the whole way. I told my boss I couldn't go back, that there was something wrong with that cabin, something he needed to know about. But he just laughed, said I was probably just spooked by the isolation, that it was just an old place with some old quirks. I left the job not long after that, moved to a different town, started fresh. But sometimes in the middle of the night, I still hear the sound of that rocking chair, creaking softly back and forth. And every now and then, when I close my eyes, I see that name, scratched into the wall over and over again, like a silent, desperate plea for someone to listen. A few years back, I took a job as a night janitor at an old hotel that had been around since the early 1900s. The place was enormous, with winding hallways and floors that creaked no matter how softly you stepped. Most of the guests were business types who never stayed long, and the night shifts were usually quiet. My main tasks were to mop the lobby, clean the hallways, and check the empty conference rooms. One night, I was working on the top floor, where the long-term guests stayed. It was around 3 a.m., that hour when the world feels the most deserted. I was mopping the hallway, lost in my own thoughts, when I heard it, an old-fashioned melody drifting faintly down the hall. It was soft, barely there, as if coming from a radio in a far-off room. I paused, listening, but the music stopped as soon as I tried to focus on it. I shrugged it off, figuring maybe someone had their TV on. I went back to work, but then I heard it again. This time it was clearer, a low, haunting tune like something you'd hear in an old ballroom. I couldn't place the song, but there was something about it that gave me a chill, the notes hanging in the air like they'd been trapped there for decades. I walked down the hall, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from, but every time I got closer, it seemed to drift further away. Finally, I reached room 709, a room that was supposed to be empty. I stopped outside, my hand on the doorknob, listening. The music was louder here, the tune unmistakable, each note clear as if someone were playing it just on the other side of the door. Curiosity got the better of me, and I pulled out my master key. I took a deep breath, unlocked the door, and slowly pushed it open. The room was dark, untouched, the bed neatly made, everything as it should be. But the music was louder now, filling the room with that eerie, old-fashioned tune. My heart pounded as I stepped inside, my eyes scanning the shadows, half expecting to see someone there. The music faded, drifting off as if it had never been there, leaving only silence and the faint hum of the air conditioner. I turned to leave, shaking my head, feeling foolish. But just as I reached the door, I caught a glimpse of something in the mirror on the opposite wall. There, standing behind me, was a woman. I froze, every muscle tensing as I stared at her reflection. She was dressed in a long, elegant gown, her hair styled in waves that looked straight out of the 1920s. Her face was pale, expressionless, her eyes distant, as if she were looking through me rather than at me. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But before I could move, she raised her hand, pointing toward the corner of the room. I turned around, heart pounding, but the corner was empty. I glanced back at the mirror, and she was gone. The room was silent again. No trace of the music or the woman, just the faint scent of something old, like lavender and dust. I backed out of the room, shutting the door behind me, and tried to steady my breathing. I convinced myself it was just my mind playing tricks, the late hour and the quiet of the hotel getting to me. But as I walked back down the hall, I could feel a presence behind me, like someone was watching, following. I finished my shift in record time, barely able to focus, every shadow and creak of the building setting my nerves on edge. The next morning, as I was leaving, I ran into one of the older staff members, a woman who'd been working there for over 30 years. I mentioned the strange experience, laughing it off, hoping she'd tell me it was nothing. Instead, she gave me a serious look, her face paling a little. "You heard the music, didn't you?" I nodded, my heart sinking. She sighed, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening, and then she leaned in close. "That room, we don't put guests there if we can help it. People have heard things, seen things. They say a woman used to stay there back in the 1920s. She was a singer, performed in the ballroom downstairs. She passed away in that room under strange circumstances. Since then, people have claimed to hear her singing, and some even say they've seen her, just like you did." I felt a chill run down my spine as her words sank in. She gave me a sympathetic smile. "Don't worry. She's harmless, just lost, I think. Stuck, waiting for something or someone." I never went back to room 709. Even now, years later, I still think about that woman, the way her eyes seemed so distant, her hand pointing to something I couldn't see. And sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night, I'll hear that same haunting melody, faint and distant, as if she's still there, waiting, her voice echoing through the halls, carrying on a song that no one remembers. I don't know if I'll ever really be able to explain what happened to me, but I need to try. I haven't been the same since that night, and I'm starting to think that maybe I'm not the only one it's happened to. It was about 6 months ago. I just moved into a new apartment, a little one-bedroom in an older building. It was affordable, quiet, and close to work, so I figured it was perfect. The only thing I didn't love was the basement laundry room. Something about it was just off. The first time I went down there, I noticed how cold it was, colder than it should have been even for a basement. The room itself was huge and mostly empty, with old machines pushed against one wall, a few dim overhead lights, and a concrete floor that looked permanently stained. And there was always this strange, lingering smell in the air, faint like damp earth, mixed with something metallic. But I didn't have any other option, so I told myself I'd get used to it. One night, around midnight, I was out of clean clothes and decided to do a quick load of laundry before bed. The building was quiet, everyone asleep, and the halls were dark. As I got to the basement stairs, I hesitated, feeling a strange prickling at the back of my neck, like something was warning me to turn around. But I brushed it off as nerves. I told myself I was being silly, that it was just an old basement. I went down, my footsteps echoing in the silence, and flipped on the lights. The fluorescent bulbs flickered, casting strange, jittery shadows across the walls. I loaded my clothes into one of the machines, threw in some detergent, and started the wash. As the machine hummed to life, I pulled out my phone to kill time. That's when I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping, coming from somewhere down the hall, just beyond the glow of the flickering lights. I froze, every muscle tensed, listening. It was so faint that I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. But then it came again, tap, 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 closer this time, echoing through the empty basement. I shined my phone's flashlight down the hall, but there was nothing there, just shadows stretching into the darkness. I tried to brush it off, figuring it was some old pipe, but the sound kept coming, steady and deliberate, like someone or something was moving closer. My heart was racing, but I didn't want to leave my clothes, so I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was just paranoid. Then, the lights started to flicker more intensely, casting the hallway in brief flashes of light and shadow. In one of those flashes, I saw something, just for a split second, a figure standing at the far end of the hall. It was tall, unnaturally thin, with limbs that looked too long, too distorted, and it was staring right at me. I blinked, and the lights went dark. My phone's flashlight was still on, but it barely lit up the space around me. I backed up against the washing machine, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I aimed my phone's light down the hall, but the figure was gone. The silence pressed in, thick and heavy, and I could hear my own breath, shallow and quick. I was about to bolt back up the stairs when the lights flickered on again, weak but steady. And that's when I saw it. The figure was closer now, halfway down the hall, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, like it was studying me. Its face was pale, almost gray, and its eyes were wrong. Dark, hollow, like deep pits, staring at me with this horrible, hungry expression. I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. I just stood there, rooted in place, watching as it took a slow, deliberate step forward, and then another, its movements jerky and unnatural, like it was struggling to control its own limbs. I finally snapped out of my shock and bolted for the stairs, not daring to look back. My footsteps echoed through the basement as I ran. But as I reached the stairs, I heard something else, a whisper, faint and hollow, like a voice carried on a distant wind. "Don't leave!" I ignored it, sprinting up the stairs and slamming the basement door behind me. I stood there, panting, my hand shaking as I locked the door, my heart racing as if it was about to explode. I could still hear that whisper echoing in my mind, that faint, pleading voice. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, lights on, listening to every creak and groan in the apartment, half expecting to hear footsteps coming up the stairs. I told myself it was just my imagination, that it was nothing but shadows and nerves. But the next morning, when I went back to the basement to get my clothes, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In the middle of the floor, right where I'd been standing the night before, was a dark, wet footprint. And another, leading away from the washing machines and disappearing into the darkness at the far end of the room. I grabbed my clothes and left without looking back, barely daring to breathe. For weeks, I avoided doing laundry at night, sticking to the early hours when the basement felt a little less sinister, a little less haunted. But last week, I had no choice. It was late, I was out of clothes, and I had work the next morning, so I decided to risk it. I told myself that whatever I'd seen was just a trick of the light, that there was nothing to be afraid of. As soon as I stepped into the basement, though, that feeling came back. That prickling at the back of my neck, that creeping sense that I was being watched. I loaded my clothes quickly, my eyes darting toward the hallway every few seconds. half expecting to see that figure standing there. I kept the washing cycle short, waiting by the machine, my body tense, every sound amplified in the silence. Just as the wash finished, the lights flickered, and I felt the air go cold, so cold I could see my breath in front of me. And then, just behind me, I heard it, the same soft, rhythmic tapping, echoing through the basement, coming from the darkness down the hall. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my clothes, not even bothering to put them in the dryer, and sprinted up the stairs, my footsteps pounding in sync with that horrible tapping. I slammed the door shut behind me, breathing hard, my heart racing, and then I heard it, a soft, hollow voice whispering from the other side of the door. "Come back!" I locked the door, backing away, the voice growing fainter but more insistent, repeating over and over, "Come back, come back." That night, I heard the tapping again. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that it was just the pipes, just my mind playing tricks, when I heard it, faint but unmistakable, coming from the walls, moving closer. Top, top, top. And then, from somewhere in the darkness, that same whisper. "Don't leave me. I haven't been back to the basement since. I don't know if I'll ever go back." I can still hear that voice sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet, calling to me, begging me to return. And I'm starting to think that maybe, someday, I won't be able to resist. It was a foggy evening when I found the key. I was walking home after a late night at work, taking a shortcut through a small, overgrown park that most people avoided. The park was empty, shrouded in mist, and I could barely see 10 feet ahead. I just turned onto the path when I spotted something glinting on the ground, half buried in a patch of grass. Curious, I knelt down and picked it up, brushing the dirt away. It was an old-fashioned brass key, intricate and heavy, the kind that looked like it might belong to an ancient chest or a mysterious mansion. It had an engraving on the handle, 17, and I stared at it, feeling a strange thrill, like I'd stumbled upon a secret. I pocketed the key, figuring I'd take a closer look when I got home. But as I straightened up, I noticed something odd. Through the fog, I could just make out the faint outline of a building on the other side of the park, a tall, dark shape that hadn't been there before. A prickle of unease ran down my spine. I'd walked this path countless times and knew every tree, every bench, every streetlight. There was no building in this park. But tonight, there it was, looming through the mist like it had stepped out of another time. I don't know why, but I felt drawn to it, like the key in my pocket was tugging me forward. As I got closer, I saw that it was an old house, tall and narrow, with ivy crawling up the sides and boarded-up windows. The door was heavy wood, painted a dark green, with a brass plate in the center that read 17. I took the key from my pocket, staring at it, feeling a strange sense of destiny. This was where the key belonged. I hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath and slid the key into the lock. It fit perfectly, and with a soft click, the door creaked open, revealing a dark hallway lined with faded wallpaper and dusty picture frames. I stepped inside, the door closing quietly behind me, and the silence wrapped around me like a blanket. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and dust, and the faintest hint of lavender. I could see now that the house was filled with furniture covered in white sheets, as though it had been abandoned in a hurry. There was an odd feeling in the air, something almost alive, like the house was watching me. But there was also a sense of welcome, as if I'd been expected. The hallway led to a grand staircase, and on the first step was a small envelope, yellowed with age, my name scrawled on the front in elegant handwriting. I picked it up, my heart pounding, and opened it. Inside was a short note. "Welcome, James. Upstairs, you'll find what you came here for. Room 17. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone waiting in the shadows, but the house was empty, silent. Taking a deep breath, I made my way up the stairs, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. At the top of the staircase, a long hallway stretched before me, lined with closed doors. Each door had a brass number nailed to it, but it was hard to read in the dim light. I walked slowly, counting each number as I passed, until I reached the last door on the right, 17. The key, warm in my pocket, seemed to hum with anticipation. I placed my hand on the doorknob and turned it slowly, pushing the door open. Inside, the room was small and sparsely furnished, with a single armchair by the window and a small, round table in the center. But what caught my attention was the mirror on the far wall. It was enormous, its frame gilded and ornate, with designs that seemed to twist and turn in the flickering candlelight. The glass was hazy, like it was made from smoke instead of silver. I stepped closer, staring at my reflection. But as I looked, something strange happened. The mirror didn't just reflect me. It showed me in another place, another time. I was standing in a different version of this room, furnished with rich carpets and golden lights spilling from tall windows. It felt like a memory, something old and forgotten. And then I saw her. A young woman appeared in the reflection, standing beside me. She wore a long dress, her hair pinned back, her face soft and kind. She looked at me with a familiarity that sent chills down my spine, like she knew me, like she had been waiting. "James," she said softly, her voice like a memory from a dream. "You found the key." I turned, half expecting her to be in the room with me, but I was alone. When I looked back at the mirror, she was still there, watching me. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Her expression softened, a hint of sadness in her eyes. "You don't remember, do you?" I shook my head, feeling a strange ache in my chest, like I'd lost something precious but couldn't remember what. "You promised," she said, her voice tinged with sorrow. "You promised you'd come back." Her words stirred something deep within me, a flicker of recognition, like a door opening in my mind. Images flooded my thoughts, moments that felt like memories, but from another life, another time. I saw myself in this house, laughing with her, holding her hand as we danced in the candlelight, whispering promises to return. But then, the images darkened, filled with shadows. I saw myself leaving, the house growing empty, her face watching me go, her eyes filled with hope that slowly faded to sorrow. "I'm sorry," I whispered, the weight of those lost promises pressing down on me. I didn't remember." She smiled faintly, her hand reaching out, pressing gently against the glass, as if she wanted to reach through, to touch me one last time. "It's not too late, James," she said softly. "The house brought you back." Her words wrapped around me like a warm breeze, filling me with a sense of peace, of closure. I placed my hand against the mirror, aligning it with hers, feeling the faintest warmth where our hands met, separated only by the glass. For a moment, everything felt still, timeless. And then, slowly, her image began to fade, her hands slipping away, her eyes filled with a quiet understanding as she disappeared into the misty depths of the mirror. The room grew dim, the air settling into a deep, comforting silence. I stood there for a long time, my hand still pressed to the mirror, feeling a strange, bittersweet ache. She was gone, but she had left a piece of herself with me, a memory, a love that transcended time. When I finally left the house, the fog had lifted, and the sky was starting to lighten with the first hints of dawn. I looked back, half expecting the house to be gone, but it stood there, silent and dark, as if it had always been part of the landscape. The key in my pocket was cold now, its purpose fulfilled. I felt lighter, as though I'd found something I hadn't even known I was searching for. As I walked back to my apartment, the memories of that night lingered, her voice echoing softly in my mind. And I knew that somewhere beyond the reach of time, she was waiting, her promise fulfilled, our story finally complete. We met during a rainy season, and I used to joke that he was the sunshine that broke through the clouds. He laughed every time I said it, rolling his eyes as he pulled me close, calling me cheesy. But it was true, at least in the beginning. He brought light into my life, something warm and bright that I hadn't even realized I'd been missing. It felt like fate, like one of those rare, magical connections that people spend their whole lives looking for. We moved in together within a year, and our lives became a blur of late-night movies, weekend trips, lazy breakfasts, and inside jokes that only made sense to us. I'd never felt so sure of anything. Our little apartment wasn't much, but we made it ours, filling it with laughter and memories, the kind of love that makes you believe in forever. Then, slowly, things started to change. It was subtle at first. He'd get quiet sometimes, drifting off into his own world even when we were together. I'd ask if everything was okay, and he'd smile, ruffle my hair, saying he was just tired from work. I told myself not to worry, that everyone had off days, but the unease had started to settle, a quiet whisper in the back of my mind that I couldn't shake. One night, he came home late, smelling faintly of a perfume I didn't recognize. I laughed, asking if he'd been spritzed by a salesgirl at a department store, but he just shrugged, mumbling something about a work thing and brushing it off as if it were nothing. I wanted to believe him. I did believe him, or at least tried to. But the scent lingered, filling the space between us with something unfamiliar, something that felt like the beginning of a crack in the foundation we'd built. After that, he seemed to grow more distant. He'd always been open with his phone, leaving it on the table, unlocked, answering messages in front of me. But now, he'd keep it close, setting it face down whenever he put it down, taking it with him into every room. When I asked him about it, he laughed, saying I was being nosy and paranoid, brushing off my questions with a lightheartedness that felt forced, like he was trying too hard to keep things normal. One weekend, he told me he was going out of town for a work retreat. It was unusual, something he'd never had to do before, but I didn't question it. I trusted him, trusted what we had. But when he packed his bag, he seemed nervous, fumbling over his words, like he was hiding something just beneath the surface. I watched him leave that morning, waving from the window, telling myself that it was all in my head. But then, that same day, a friend sent me a picture. She'd seen him, not out of town, but right here, just a few neighborhoods over, laughing at a cafe with a woman I didn't know. They looked comfortable close, her hand resting lightly on his arm, his smile the easy, genuine, one-eyed thought was mine. My heart sank as I stared at the photo, the truth pressing down on me, impossible to ignore. When he came home that Sunday, I was waiting for him, sitting in the living room with that picture open on my phone. He walked in, surprised to see me sitting there, and I could see the flash of guilt in his eyes the moment he realized what was coming. I asked him who she was, my voice steady, though inside I was shaking. He started with excuses. She was just a friend. They'd run into each other by accident. But the look on his face told a different story, one he couldn't hide. I pressed him, refusing to let him brush it off this time. Finally, he admitted it. They'd met months ago, he said, and it hadn't meant to go this far. He looked down as he spoke, unable to meet my eyes, his words tumbling out in a rush of apologies and regret. But nothing he said could undo the hurt, the betrayal that was now woven into every memory we'd shared. I told him to leave. He tried to argue, saying it was a mistake, that he'd end it, that he was sorry. But I couldn't listen. I didn't want to listen. I watched as he packed a bag, every movement feeling surreal, like I was watching someone else's life fall apart. When he finally left, the door closing softly behind him, I felt an emptiness settle over me, a cold ache that filled the spaces he'd left behind. In the days that followed, I went through all the stages of grief, anger, sadness, disbelief. Friends came by, sitting with me in the quiet, offering support and gentle reminders that I'd be okay. I deleted his photos, put away the things he'd left behind, trying to erase the traces of him from my life. But the memories lingered, each one a sharp reminder of the trust he'd broken. But as time passed, I began to heal. I found solace in the routines I'd forgotten. Morning walks, painting, evenings spent curled up with a good book. I learned to enjoy my own company again, to fill the silence with things that brought me peace. I rearranged the apartment, filling it with new things, new memories, reclaiming the space as my own. Months later, he reached out, asking to meet. He wanted to apologize, he said, to talk things through. Part of me wanted to go, to hear his explanation, to find some kind of closure. But as I thought about it, I realized that I didn't need his apology. I'd already found my own peace, my own sense of closure. I was stronger now, more certain of who I was and what I deserved. So I didn't reply. I let his message sit, a quiet reminder of the past I'd left behind. And as I went to bed that night, I felt a sense of lightness, a calm that had taken root where the hurt had once been. I'd loved him deeply, and losing him had broken something inside me. But in the process of putting myself back together, I'd found strength I hadn't known I possessed. Now, I look forward to the future with a heart that's whole, with scars that remind me of my resilience. I know that I deserve a love that's true, a love that doesn't hide or deceive. And until I find it, I'm content in the knowledge that I am enough, just as I am, whole and strong and more than capable of walking forward on my own. I've told myself 100 times to just forget about it, that it was probably just some strange coincidence. But every time I think I've finally let it go, it comes back like a shadow that shows up even in the dark. It was last October. I was doing overnight inventory at a warehouse just outside town. The job was mindless, just counting and checking boxes, but I didn't mind. It was quiet, and I liked the solitude. The place was enormous, a cavern of metal shelves stretching up toward the ceiling, aisles upon aisles stacked with boxes full of random stock that had been shipped in from who knows where. I was usually alone, save for one other worker, Greg, who was in charge of the inventory records. We didn't talk much, just clocked in, did our shifts, and went home. One night, the power went out. It wasn't uncommon, especially out there, where storms would knock out the grid now and then. Greg was in the back office, probably half asleep, so I went to grab my flashlight from my bag and figured I'd just wait it out. I was standing in one of the aisles when I saw it, this dim, faint light coming from somewhere down the row. I assumed it was Greg with his phone, maybe doing a check to make sure things were okay. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't coming from a phone or a flashlight. It was this strange, weak glow, like the kind of light a candle gives off, flickering just enough to make you doubt what you were seeing. I called out, "Greg?" but there was no response. I moved closer, cautiously, the hair on the back of my neck prickling. I reached the end of the row, and that's when I saw it, a small, old-fashioned lantern sitting on the floor. The kind you'd see in old movies, made of metal with a glass case. It looked ancient, out of place among all the cardboard boxes and metal shelves. I looked around, half expecting Greg to jump out and scare me, but there was no one there. Just the lantern, flickering gently, casting strange shadows across the aisle. I knelt down, reaching out to pick it up, but as my fingers touched the cold metal, the light went out, leaving me in complete darkness. I stood there, frozen, heart pounding, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. The power was still out, and my flashlight was back in my bag. I fumbled for my phone, turned on the screen, and swept it around, lighting up the rows of boxes. But the lantern was gone, vanished like it had never been there. I went back to the office, a strange chill creeping up my spine. When I opened the door, Greg was sitting at the desk, his head down on his arms, fast asleep. I shook him awake, told him about the lantern, hoping he'd laugh it off, tell me it was just a prank. But he looked at me, eyes bleary, and said he hadn't left the office all night. After the power came back on, I searched the entire warehouse, every row and aisle, but there was no sign of the lantern. It was just gone. I couldn't stop thinking about it, though. It was so vivid, so real, that I started wondering if I just imagined it. I told myself it was a trick of the dark, that maybe my mind had conjured it up in the silence. But then, the following week, something else happened. It was around midnight, and I was in the far back corner of the warehouse, checking off boxes from a list. I was alone, deep in concentration, when I heard it, a faint humming sound. It was soft, almost like someone whispering a melody, drifting through the aisles. I stopped, straining to hear, but the humming continued, echoing through the warehouse. I walked slowly toward the sound, the hairs on my arms standing up. As I got closer, the humming grew louder until it was just a few feet away. I turned the corner, expecting to see someone standing there, but the aisle was empty. And then I saw it again, the lantern sitting on the floor, flickering softly. This time, the light was brighter, casting longer shadows across the boxes, illuminating the words stamped on their sides. I took a step back, every instinct telling me to leave, but something kept me rooted to the spot. The humming grew louder, almost like it was coming from the lantern itself. I leaned closer, my breath fogging up in the cold air, and that's when I saw the name scratched into the metal base, Margaret. The name meant nothing to me, but the sight of it sent a chill through my bones. I reached out to touch it, to see if it was real, but as my fingers brushed the cold metal, the humming stopped, and the light flickered out again. I stumbled back, breathing hard, and nearly tripped over a stack of boxes. I looked around, desperate to find some explanation, but the warehouse was silent, empty. The lantern had disappeared once more, leaving no trace that it had ever been there. The rest of the shift passed in a blur. I barely spoke to Greg, didn't mention what I'd seen, but I couldn't stop thinking about the lantern, about the name scratched into the base. I tried searching the records, looking up the name Margaret to see if it meant anything, but I found nothing. Just a name, scratched into metal, a haunting echo of something long gone. Then, a few days later, I found something else, an old, faded photograph, tucked between two boxes on a shelf near where I'd seen the lantern. It was yellowed, the edges frayed, and the image was barely visible. But I could just make out the outline of a woman standing in front of what looked like an old house. She was smiling, one hand resting on a small lantern identical to the one I'd seen. And on the back of the photo, in faded ink, was a name, Margaret. I don't know who put the photo there, or how it had ended up in the warehouse, but something about it felt wrong, like it didn't belong there, like it was a piece of someone else's life that had slipped through the cracks. That was my last week working at the warehouse. I couldn't go back. Not after that. I never told Greg what I'd seen, and I never mentioned it to anyone else. I just left trying to put it all behind me. But sometimes late at night, when everything is quiet, I hear that faint humming again. It drifts through the silence, soft and haunting, like someone calling from far away. And every time I hear it, I can almost see the lantern, flickering in the darkness, and I wonder if Margaret is still out there, waiting, searching for something she left behind. I'm an ER nurse, night shift. You see everything in this line of work, and you get used to people at their worst. After a while, it all blends together. The bruises, the blood, the chaos. But there was one night, not long ago, that I can't forget, no matter how hard I try. It was around 3 a.m., and things had slowed down a bit. Just as I sat down to grab a quick coffee, a call came in. Unresponsive male, late 20s, found at a bus stop. We get a lot of overdose cases, so that's what I assumed it would be. But when the paramedics brought him in, he didn't look like the usual OD. He was well-dressed, clean, no signs of drugs on him. He looked normal, except for the pale, almost gray tone to his skin and the way his eyes seemed half-open, unfocused, staring past everyone in the room. We got him onto a bed and hooked up the monitors. His heart rate was low, dangerously low, and his breathing was shallow. I leaned over, calling his name, trying to bring him around. His eyes flickered, but he didn't respond. I checked his arms, his hands, looking for any signs of self-harm or needle marks, but there was nothing. His clothes were clean, his nails neatly trimmed. Everything about him looked ordinary, except for the fact that he was almost completely unresponsive. Finally, as I was adjusting his oxygen mask, his hand shot up, grabbing my wrist with a force that surprised me. His eyes locked onto mine, and for the first time, he seemed aware, like he'd finally registered where he was. He pulled me closer, and with a voice that was barely a whisper, he said, "Don't let me fall asleep." I tried to reassure him, telling him he was safe, that we'd take care of him. But he shook his head, his grip tightening. "No," he rasped. "You don't understand. They come when you're asleep." He looked terrified, his eyes darting around the room like he expected someone, or something, to appear out of nowhere. I told him he was in the hospital, that he was safe here, but he didn't seem to hear me. He kept mumbling to himself, repeating the same phrase over and over. "They come when you're asleep. They come when you're asleep." I could feel a chill settling over me, but I kept my composure, trying to focus on the job. I asked him who he thought was coming, if there was someone we needed to call. He just stared at me, his face pale, and said, "You don't get it. They don't stop. They follow you, and they don't let go." The doctor came in, and we decided to sedate him for his own safety. He was clearly in a state of panic, and we thought maybe he was experiencing some kind of psychotic episode or hallucination. As we prepped him for the sedative, he looked up at me one last time and whispered, "I try to stay awake." I tried so hard. The sedative took effect quickly, and his grip on my wrist loosened. I stayed in the room a few minutes longer than usual, just watching him, trying to shake the unease I felt. He seemed peaceful now, breathing steadily, his face relaxed. I told myself that whatever he'd been running from was just in his head, just the result of exhaustion or stress or something I couldn't understand. I went back to my rounds, trying to put it out of my mind, but I couldn't stop thinking about his words. They come when you're asleep. The way he'd said it, the fear in his eyes, it was haunting. About an hour later, I passed by his room again to check his vitals, just routine. But when I looked in, I froze. His bed was empty. The blankets were rumpled, his four still in place, but he was gone. I checked with the other nurses, assuming he'd somehow woken up and walked out. But no one had seen him leave. Security checked the cameras, but there was no sign of him anywhere in the hospital. It was like he'd just vanished, leaving no trace. For weeks after, I couldn't get him out of my mind. I'd look up from my station in the early hours of the morning and almost expect to see him standing there, those terrified eyes staring back at me. I kept hearing his voice in my head, that desperate, pleading tone. Don't let me fall asleep. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder what he was running from, what he was so afraid of. Part of me wants to believe it was all in his mind, a nightmare he couldn't escape. But another part of me, the part that's still shaken by his disappearance, can't help but wonder if maybe he was right. Maybe some things really do come when you fall asleep. And maybe he's still out there, somewhere trying to stay awake. It was a chilly autumn evening, and I was curled up on the couch with a cup of tea and a blanket, settling in to watch a movie. The house was quiet, and the comforting hum of my space heater filled the room as it warmed the living room. I'd used that heater every fall and winter for years. It was small, reliable, and kept my drafty old place cozy on the coldest nights. About halfway through the movie, I started to drift off. My eyelids grew heavy, and the warmth from the heater made it impossible to resist a little nap. I must have dozed off for a good hour because when I woke up, the room felt almost too warm, stuffy even. The heater was still running, and as I stretched and looked around, something strange caught my eye, a faint, dark patch on the wall right behind the heater. I squinted, trying to make sense of it. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, maybe a trick of the low evening light. But when I got up to take a closer look, I realized it wasn't a shadow at all. It was a scorch mark. A dark, smoky stain was spreading up the wall behind the heater, and the plastic casing of the heater itself looked warped, as if it had started to melt. My stomach twisted with panic. I quickly unplugged the heater, feeling the heat radiating off it even from a distance. The wall was hot to the touch, and the scorch mark was bigger than I'd thought, stretching a good foot up from the baseboard. I just stood there, staring at it, trying to process what had almost happened. If I'd slept even a little longer, the heat could have sparked a fire right there in my living room. I opened the windows to let the room cool down, feeling a strange mix of relief and horror. That little heater, which had always been a source of comfort, had nearly turned into a danger without me even realizing it. I'd always trusted it, never questioned its safety. But it was old, probably a model from 10 or 15 years ago, and I hadn't thought about the wear and tear that might have accumulated over time. The next morning, I took the heater outside to inspect it in better light. Sure enough, the casing was brittle, cracked in several places from years of use. The fan inside looked dusty, and I realized that I'd never once cleaned it or checked it for problems. It was just one of those things I'd taken for granted, assuming it would always work like it did when it was new. I threw it out that day and decided to get a new one with safety features like automatic shutoff and a cool touch casing. As I shopped for a replacement, I found myself reading every review, every detail about overheating protection, determined to avoid another close call. That experience changed the way I looked at all my appliances. I went around my house, checking everything I usually left plugged in, the toaster, the coffee maker, even the power strips in my home office. I never really thought about how long I'd had them, whether they were in good condition or if they had safety features. I found a few other things that had seen better days, cords with worn insulation, appliances with strange rattles, and I decided it was time for some replacements. A few days later, I mentioned the heater incident to my friend Lily, who had a similar one in her bedroom. She looked surprised and admitted she'd never really checked her heater either. I think mine's even older than yours, she said, laughing nervously. That night, she texted me a photo of her new heater, saying she'd finally swapped it out and felt a lot better knowing it was safer. These days, I don't take my home's little comforts for granted. I'm more careful with everything, from the way I use my space heater to how I maintain the other devices around my house. It's a small effort, but it feels like a worthwhile one, a way of respecting the hidden risks that come with everyday things. Now, every time I plug in my new heater, I think back to that scorched wall and the old heater I trusted for too long. I've learned that safety isn't about assuming everything will work as it always has. It's about taking a closer look, asking questions, and knowing when to replace the things we rely on. Because sometimes, even the most familiar objects can hold unexpected risks, and it's up to us to catch them before they catch us. I can't believe I'm writing this. Part of me thinks that putting it into words will make it worse, like it'll somehow make it real. But I haven't slept in days, and I feel like I'm going crazy. Maybe if I tell anyone, what happened, it'll finally leave me alone. It started a few weeks ago. I live in a small apartment complex, nothing fancy, just a few units with thin walls where you can hear your neighbors arguing or playing music too loud. I work odd hours, so I'm used to the building being quiet at night. But one evening, around 3 a.m., I heard something strange. It was faint at first, a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere above me. I assumed it was just a neighbor, maybe someone moving around late at night, and tried to ignore it. But the tapping didn't stop. It went on steady and relentless tap, 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 like someone was walking in circles or pacing in one spot. I tried to fall asleep, but the sound was maddening, digging into my brain like an itch I couldn't scratch. The next night, the tapping started again at exactly the same time. I got out of bed, frustrated, and went upstairs to see if my neighbor was awake and making noise. But when I got to the door of the unit directly above mine, I noticed something strange. The door was slightly open, and the lights inside were off. I hesitated, feeling a little uneasy. I didn't know the people who lived there well, but I'd seen them a few times, a quiet couple who mostly kept to themselves. I called out softly, asking if anyone was home, but there was no answer. Just silence. After a moment, I decided it wasn't my business and went back downstairs, telling myself I was being paranoid. But the tapping continued every night at exactly 3 a.m., always coming from the apartment above me. After a week of sleepless nights, I couldn't take it anymore. I called the building manager and explained what was happening, expecting him to say it was just a plumbing issue or maybe a maintenance thing. But instead, he went quiet. "You said it's coming from the unit above you?" he asked, his voice tense. "Yeah," I replied, feeling a knot of unease forming in my stomach. "Why?" He hesitated, then cleared his throat. "No one lives in that apartment," he said quietly. "It's been empty for months." I felt a chill run down my spine. "No, that's impossible," I stammered. "I've heard people up there. I've seen them." The manager sighed. "I don't know what to tell you. The last tenants moved out months ago, and no one's been there since." I hung up feeling sick, my mind racing. I couldn't understand it. I'd seen the couple who lived there, seen them coming and going. But now, it was as if they'd vanished, leaving behind only that constant, maddening tapping. That night, I stayed up, waiting for 3 a.m., convinced that I'd finally prove it was all in my head. But right on time, the tapping began, slow and steady, echoing through the ceiling like clockwork. My heart was pounding, but I couldn't resist. I got dressed, grabbed my flashlight, and headed upstairs. The door to the apartment was still slightly ajar, just as it had been before. Taking a deep breath, I pushed it open and stepped inside. The air was cold and stale, and the smell of dampness filled the dark room. My flashlight flickered as I moved through the empty space, illuminating bare walls and dusty floors. It didn't look like anyone had lived there for a long time. I was about to leave, feeling a mix of relief and disappointment, when I heard it, the tapping, loud and clear, coming from the far corner of the room. My flashlight flickered again, and I shone it toward the sound, but there was nothing there. Just an empty corner, dark and silent. And then, out of the silence, I heard something else, a faint whisper so soft I could barely make it out. "Why did you leave me?" My blood ran cold. I didn't wait to hear anything else. I turned and ran, slamming the door behind me, my heart racing as I stumbled down the stairs and back into my apartment. I locked the door, bolted it, and stood there, breathing hard, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But then, as I stood there in the dark, I heard it again. The tapping. Not from above me, but from inside my own apartment, coming from the other side of my bedroom wall. I backed away, my hands shaking, listening as the tapping grew louder, more insistent, almost frantic. It felt like it was coming closer, moving toward me, each tap vibrating through the walls. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, too afraid to move, until finally the tapping stopped. The silence was so complete, so heavy, that I could barely breathe. And then from the other side of the wall, I heard that same whisper, clear and distinct. "Why did you leave me here?" I couldn't sleep that night. I sat up in bed, every light in the apartment on, listening to every creak, every gust of wind, terrified that the tapping would start again. The next day, I tried to ask the building manager about the last tenants, hoping he'd tell me something that would make this all make sense. But he just gave me this strange, guarded look. "They left in a hurry," he said finally, avoiding my gaze. Didn't say much, just that they couldn't stay here anymore. So there was something wrong with the place. Something that, he trailed off, shaking his head. "Look, I don't know what's going on, but you're not the first person to hear things in that unit." I left his office feeling more confused, more terrified than ever. And that night, as I lay in bed, waiting for the inevitable, I heard it again. The tapping coming from the wall, growing louder, more insistent, as if it were trying to break through. For weeks, it continued. Every night, the same tapping, the same whispered question, repeating over and over, each time a little louder, a little closer. I don't know what it wants from me, or why it chose me. But every night, it feels like it's getting closer, like it's just on the other side of the wall, waiting for me to answer. And I'm terrified that one night, I won't be able to ignore it anymore. My friend Sarah had been looking forward to this job opportunity for months. She'd been talking about it nonstop. The role was a perfect match with a company she admired, doing work that actually mattered to her. She spent hours prepping for every interview round, crafting thoughtful responses, tackling assignments, and putting together presentations that practically read like a blueprint for the role. She was in deep, picturing herself in that office, thinking about how she'd decorate her desk. But after the final interview, days passed, then weeks. When she finally emailed to check in, they replied with a curt, "Thanks for your time, but we've decided to go in a different direction. No feedback, no explanation. Just a dead end. All that, and they couldn't even bother with a real response?" she said, defeated. "Feels like they just used me as a backup plan." That same week, my other friend Danny was trying to score tickets to a concert he'd been waiting on for years. A reunion tour for his favorite band. He cleared his schedule, set multiple alarms, and was ready to click the second tickets went live. But before he even got a chance, they were sold out. Just like that. He checked resale sites, and there they were at triple the price, priced so high only the super wealthy could even think about affording it. "It's like they don't even care about actual fans," he told me, showing me the insane prices. "They're just selling nostalgia to whoever can pay the most. The rest of us don't even get a shot." A few nights later, Sarah, Danny, and I met up at a bar to unwind. Sarah was still nursing the sting of rejection, and Danny couldn't stop shaking his head about the tickets. We sat there, quietly feeling like the world was stacking the deck against us. Then our friend Alex joined us, and he had his own story. Alex works in tech, and he's usually excited about new gadgets and innovation. But lately, he's been looking at it all differently. "You guys have no idea how much we're being watched," he said, his voice low. "Every app, every website, every click, it's all tracked, recorded, and sold off." He went on explaining how companies gather data on people, even the stuff we'd never think twice about, and sell it to whoever wants to buy. They say it's about making our lives easier, but it's just another way to make money off us. We all sat there in silence, realizing just how little control we actually had over our own lives. Our phones, our data, everything was a product in someone else's hands. And while we were talking, a news alert popped up on Danny's phone about yet another insider trading scandal involving Congress. It was the usual story. Politicians who'd sold off stocks right before a major economic downturn, saving themselves millions while everyone else suffered the fallout. So they get the inside scoop, protect themselves, and let the rest of us drown? Danny muttered. It's like the rules only apply to us, never to them. On the walk back home, we passed by a flashing billboard for an online gambling app. It showed a guy winning big, his face lit up in excitement, with friends cheering him on like he just struck gold. Sarah scoffed, saying they make it look like it's so easy to win. She told us about her brother, who'd gotten sucked into online sports betting during a rough patch. What started as a distraction quickly spiraled into something darker, leaving him with a massive debt he couldn't shake. They make it look like fun, like a thrill, she said, her voice bitter. But they're just baiting people into throwing their lives away. As we reached Sarah's place, she looked back at us and sighed. It's like everything's rigged, she said quietly. Jobs, concerts, data, even the laws. It's all set up to bleed us dry. None of us had an answer, but as we went our separate ways, her words echoed in my mind, and I knew we were all feeling the same weight, wondering how much was really left that we could call our own. My friend Liam had been training for months for a marathon he'd been wanting to run since college. He was disciplined, waking up at dawn to run before work, eating clean, even turning down weekend plans to stay focused on his goal. When the day finally came to register, he was ready to claim his spot. But just minutes after registration opened, every slot was gone. Resale sites popped up within hours, offering spots at 4 times the registration fee, selling out almost instantly to people willing to pay anything just to run. Liam was crushed. It's like they've turned everything into a luxury for the rich, he said, staring at the screen. Even something as simple as running a race. At the same time, my sister Lily was dealing with a nightmare of her own. She'd been through 5 interviews for her dream job, each one more intense than the last. She'd crafted presentations, completed assignments, and given it her all. The hiring manager even hinted she was their top candidate, telling her how much they were looking forward to having her on the team. But after the final round, she got nothing. Weeks went by with no response. When she finally called to follow up, the HR rep told her they decided to pause hiring for the role. Just like that, her efforts vanished into thin air. Why even put me through all that? She asked, voice heavy with disappointment. It's like they just wanted to see how far they could push me. A few nights later, Liam, Lily, and I got together for drinks. Liam couldn't stop checking his phone, still obsessing over the marathon registration. Lily was trying to laugh off her job letdown, but I could see the frustration in her eyes. We were all feeling like the system had somehow turned against us. Then our friend Sam joined, bringing his own story. Sam works in digital marketing, and lately, he'd been noticing just how invasive data collection had become. You'd be horrified if you knew how much they're tracking, he said, looking around as if someone might overhear. Every site you visit, every ad you click, they're building profiles on all of us and selling it off like it's no big deal. He shook his head, clearly uncomfortable with it all. And it's not just for ads. They're selling to whoever pays the most, and we're the product. The 4 of us sat there, each of us grappling with how little of our lives seemed to be under our own control. Our information, our dreams, even the things we worked hardest for, it all fell up for sale like we were just pieces in a game we hadn't agreed to play. Then, as if to underline our conversation, Sam's phone buzzed with a news alert about yet another insider trading scandal involving a few politicians. Apparently, they dumped stock in an energy company right before a major environmental regulation came into effect, avoiding a massive loss. So they get to bend the rules and protect themselves, while the rest of us have to play fair? Sam said, his tone bitter. They're the ones writing the rules, and they just use them to stay one step ahead. We left the bar feeling raw, like the world was a rigged game designed to make sure we never came out on top. As we walked down the street, we passed a billboard for an online casino app, showing a guy celebrating with friends, stacks of cash in his hand, making it look like a surefire way to get rich. Lily shook her head. They banned cigarette ads because they were dangerous, but this? They're practically begging people to gamble their savings away. She told us about a friend who'd lost thousands in online poker, thinking he'd make it all back with just one more game. But that one more game turned into debt he'd been struggling to pay off for months. They make it look like a game, but it's anything but, she said. As we reached the end of the block, Liam stopped, looking back at us with a sad smile. It's like they found a way to monetize everything we care about, he said. The races, the jobs, the little joys, nothing's sacred. None of us could argue with him. We just stood there, realizing how right he was and feeling that hollow ache of knowing how little control we really had. It started innocently, or at least it felt that way. We'd been together for almost 5 years, living in a little house on the edge of town. Life felt easy with him, comfortable. I thought we had settled into that rare kind of love, the kind that's built to last. We knew each other's routines by heart, finished each other's sentences. Weekends were a blur of coffee runs, lazy mornings, dinners with friends, and quiet nights curled up on the couch. It was simple, steady. I thought it was everything I'd ever wanted. But then one Friday, he came home with a new energy, almost buzzing. He got a promotion, he said, and it meant bigger projects, more responsibility, late nights. I was thrilled for him, even though part of me worried about how things would change. But we both adjusted, or tried to. He'd come home exhausted but with a spark in his eye, and I'd listen to him talk about his work, his new team, his boss. And of course, his new coworker, Laura. At first, he mentioned her only in passing. How Laura had the same sense of humor, how she liked the same obscure bands, how she totally got his sarcastic jokes that I sometimes found too dry. I laughed along with him, teased him about his work wife, and didn't think twice about it. It felt harmless, and I trusted him. After all, he was mine. I'd never had a reason to doubt that. But over the next few months, something shifted. He'd started working later, his phone buzzing more often. He'd tell me it was just Laura sharing a joke or sending him an article. "She's hilarious," he'd say, smiling down at his screen, and I'd feel this strange, hollow ache I couldn't explain. I told myself I was being silly, jealous even, and tried to brush it off. But each time he'd laugh at a message from her, or tell me about something funny she'd said, that ache grew a little deeper. Then came the night he didn't come home. He'd gone to an office dinner, and when I texted him around 10 to check in, he didn't reply. Midnight rolled around, then 1, then 2. I lay awake, my mind running wild, until finally, at 3 in the morning, I heard the soft click of the front door. I sat up as he stumbled in, looking startled to see me awake. He mumbled an apology, saying they'd all gone out for drinks afterward and he'd lost track of time. I wanted to believe him, but I could see something in his eyes that he wasn't telling me. The next day, he was quieter than usual, distant, and that familiar ache settled back in, but sharper this time. I decided to give him space, telling myself that he was just tired, that it was just a one-off. But in the days that followed, I noticed more changes, new clothes, a sudden interest in the gym, cologne he'd never worn before. When I asked him about it, he'd brush me off, saying he just wanted to feel good, or that it was for his professional image. But it felt like he was slipping away, inch by inch, until the person I thought I knew was becoming a stranger. One evening, he left his phone on the counter while he went to grab something from the garage. I don't know what came over me, but I picked it up, my hands trembling as I opened his messages. And there it was, a conversation with Laura, spanning weeks, full of jokes, late-night confessions, little moments they'd shared at work. But there was one message that made my heart stop. A picture of them together, her leaning in close, his arm around her waist, both of them laughing like they were in their own world. When he came back inside, he found me sitting there, his phone still open, my face pale. I looked at him, and in that moment, he knew. He didn't try to lie, didn't try to make excuses. Instead, he sat down beside me, silent, his head in his hands, as if the weight of everything he'd done had finally caught up with him. We sat there for a long time, both of us too afraid to speak, too afraid to break the fragile quiet that had settled over us. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. He said it wasn't serious, that it hadn't meant to happen. But his words felt hollow, like he was grasping for an excuse that even he didn't believe. I asked him why, my voice breaking as I struggled to hold back tears. He couldn't answer, just kept saying he was sorry, that he'd been stupid, that he never wanted to hurt me. But there was a part of me that knew I'd already lost him, that the man sitting beside me wasn't the person I thought he was. That night, I packed a bag and left. I couldn't stay in that house, couldn't look at the life we'd built together and pretend it hadn't all come crashing down. I went to stay with a friend, spending the first few nights and days, the reality of it all sinking in. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, reaching for him, only to remember that he wasn't there, that he'd chosen someone else over the life we'd shared. In the weeks that followed, he called, texted, tried to explain, tried to make things right. He said he'd ended things with her, that he wanted to fix what he'd broken. But I couldn't bring myself to respond. I couldn't go back to someone who had looked me in the eyes every day and still chosen to betray me. Slowly, painfully, I began to rebuild. I found a new place, a tiny apartment with just enough room for me and my thoughts. I filled it with things that made me happy. Plants, books, art that felt like a reflection of who I was, who I wanted to become. I spent weekends with friends, rediscovered old hobbies, threw myself into work, and little by little, the ache began to fade, replaced by a quiet strength I hadn't known I possessed. Months later, I ran into him by chance at a coffee shop. He looked different, a little lost, like he was still carrying the weight of everything he'd done. He tried to smile, to say hello, but I just nodded, feeling nothing but a calm, detached sense of closure. The pain was gone, replaced by the knowledge that I was finally free. I walked out of that coffee shop with my head held high, a sense of peace settling over me. I had loved him deeply, and he had broken that love, shattered it in a way I'd never thought possible. But I'd survived, grown stronger, found a version of myself that didn't need him or anyone else to feel complete. Now, I look forward to the future with a heart that's whole, ready for whatever comes next. I know that I deserve a love that's honest, a love that doesn't hide or betray. And until I find it, I'm content with the life I've built on my own, a life that's real and true and entirely mine. I haven't shared this with anyone because, honestly, I'm not sure what happened myself. But it's been months now, and the memories just keep coming back, like they're scratching to get out. Maybe putting it into words will finally help me forget. This all started when I agreed to house sit for my aunt while she went on a spiritual retreat in the mountains. Her house was out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by forest. I'd always thought it was a strange place to live alone, but she loved it, said the peace and quiet helped her feel more connected. It wasn't exactly my idea of a good time, but she was paying me, and I figured I'd just spend a few nights reading and enjoying the solitude. When I got there, everything was normal, clean, cozy, with a faint scent of lavender in the air, just like I remembered. She had left a note on the kitchen table with some basics, like where to find extra towels, the Wi-Fi password, and a line that struck me as odd. Do not go into the basement, no matter what you hear. I laughed it off, assuming it was a joke. My aunt was a quirky person, so it seemed like the kind of thing she'd write to mess with me. But still, the warning stuck in the back of my mind. The first night was uneventful. I watched some TV, read a little, and went to bed early. The house was quiet, too quiet almost, and the sounds of the forest outside were muted, like the trees themselves were holding their breath. But I told myself it was just my imagination, the effect of being alone in a strange place. Then, the second night I heard it, I was lying in bed, just starting to drift off when a faint sound pulled me back. At first, I thought it was coming from outside, a branch scraping against the window, maybe a raccoon rustling in the bushes. But as I listened, I realized it was coming from below me, from the basement. It was soft, rhythmic, like someone tapping on a pipe, steady and deliberate. I told myself it was probably just the old house settling, or maybe some animal that had gotten trapped down there. But as the tapping continued, it started to sound purposeful, like someone was knocking, waiting for me to answer. I lay there, staring up at the ceiling, every muscle tense until finally the tapping stopped. I told myself it was just a house, that it was nothing, but sleep didn't come easy. The next morning, I went down to the kitchen, bleary-eyed, telling myself I'd been overreacting. I opened the fridge to get some water, and that's when I noticed it. The door to the basement was ajar. Not wide open, just cracked, as if someone had peeked out and left it that way. My heart skipped a beat, but I brushed it off, telling myself I'd just forgotten to close it all the way the night before. I closed the door, made sure it was latched, and went about my day, trying to ignore the nagging feeling in my stomach. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again. The same tapping coming from the basement, louder this time, more insistent. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself it was nothing, but the tapping grew faster, more frantic, like it was demanding my attention. I don't know what came over me, but I got out of bed, heart pounding, and went to the basement door. I don't know what I was expecting, to tell off whatever was making the noise, maybe prove to myself that it was just some loose pipe. But as I stood there, my hand on the doorknob, the tapping stopped. The silence was deafening, thick and heavy, pressing down on me like a weight. And then, from the other side of the door, I heard a whisper. "Let me out!" I stumbled back, my heart racing, every instinct screaming at me to run. I locked the door, shoved a chair in front of it, and backed away, my hands shaking. I told myself it was my imagination, that I was just spooking myself out. But that voice, it was so clear, so desperate, like someone was trapped down there, waiting for me to set them free. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room, every light on, my eyes fixed on the basement door. I kept expecting to hear it again, to hear that faint whisper, but the house was silent. The next day, I tried calling my aunt, wanting some kind of reassurance, but her phone went straight to voicemail. I told myself it didn't matter, that I was overreacting, that it was just an old house making noise. But as night fell, I felt that same dread creeping over me, that same sense that something was waiting for me. I didn't go to bed that night. I sat in the living room, clutching my phone, waiting, listening, and right on cue, the tapping started, faint and rhythmic, echoing up from the basement. This time, it was accompanied by a soft scratching, like fingernails scraping against wood. I wanted to leave, to get in my car and drive as far from that house as I could. But I was frozen, paralyzed by the fear that whatever was in the basement would follow me, that it would never let me go. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like it was right behind the door, waiting for me. I covered my ears, trying to block it out, but the whisper slipped through, soft and pleading. "Please let me out." I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my things, threw them in a bag, and bolted out of the house. I drove to a motel in town, my heart racing, not stopping until I was locked in a room, far away from that place. The next morning, I got a call from my aunt. She sounded calm, cheerful, like nothing was wrong. I tried to explain what had happened about the tapping, the whispers, but she just laughed. "Oh, you heard it too?" she said, like it was the most natural thing in the world. "I told you not to go down there." I felt a chill run down my spine. What is it?" I asked, barely able to get the words out. There was a pause on the other end, and then, in the same calm tone, she replied, "Just something that's been there for a long, long time. It can't get out as long as the door stays shut." I hung up, feeling like I was going to be sick. I haven't spoken to her since, haven't been back to that house, and I don't plan to. But every now and then, late at night, I'll hear it, the faint, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere just beyond the edge of hearing, followed by that soft, desperate whisper, "Please let me out." We'd been together for nearly a decade, the kind of love that felt woven into the fabric of my life as natural as breathing. We grew up in the same town, shared mutual friends, and even went to the same college. Our love story had felt almost predestined, inevitable in the best possible way. We'd built our life from scratch, from a cramped apartment just after graduation to a cozy little house with a garden and a dog named Max. Everyone saw us as a team, and so did I. I don't know when things started to change, but looking back, there were signs. Small, almost invisible shifts that at the time I wrote off as the natural ebb and flow of a long-term relationship. He'd come home from work a little later each night, saying he was catching up on projects. I'd wait up for him, even though I'd be exhausted by the time he walked through the door, smelling faintly of beer or cologne that wasn't his. He started going to the gym more often, something he'd never cared much about before. At first, I was proud of him, encouraging his new healthy habits. But soon he'd be gone for hours, coming home flushed, sometimes showered. I joked once, asking if he had a gym crush or something. He laughed it off, giving me a playful nudge, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a fleeting moment where he looked away, and I felt that first pang of doubt. Then came the nights he'd crash at a friend's place after an office happy hour, saying he'd had too much to drink and didn't want to drive home. It only happened a couple of times, but it was enough to plant that unsettling seed in the back of my mind. I'd tell myself it was nothing, that he was just being responsible. After all, he always came back, didn't he? But the quiet spaces he left behind grew louder, and the unease began to creep in. One Saturday, he told me he'd be helping a friend move all day. I offered to join them, to help out or bring food, but he brushed it off, saying it'd be a quick job and that he'd be home by evening. Evening came and went, and by midnight, I was sitting alone in the living room, my worry evolving into dread. I texted him, but hours passed with no reply. Finally, he stumbled through the door around 3 a.m, mumbling something about losing track of time. I asked him where he'd been, and he gave me this vague story about going out for drinks after the move and not realizing how late it was. I wanted to believe him, but there was a part of me that couldn't ignore the way his words didn't quite match his expression, the way he seemed unable to meet my gaze. In the days that followed, I felt like I was unraveling, haunted by 1,000 little clues that had seemed harmless until they'd piled up into a mountain I couldn't ignore. His phone, once left carelessly around the house, was now always in his pocket, locked and silenced. He'd step out to take calls, muttering something about work stuff, but his voice would lower when he thought I couldn't hear. I didn't want to become the kind of person who snoops, but I felt trapped, torn between the fear of the truth and the agony of not knowing. One night, he left his laptop open on the kitchen table, and I saw an open email thread. It was from someone named Elena. I didn't know anyone in his life named Elena. The subject line read simply, "Last night, Red Heart." My stomach flipped as I clicked on it, my hands shaking. The message was brief, but enough to confirm what my heart had feared all along. A series of plans they'd made together, a line about how much she missed him. I felt a hollow ache settle over me, as if the life we'd built together had suddenly evaporated. When he came home that evening, I was waiting for him, sitting in the dim light of the kitchen with the laptop open on the table. He stopped short when he saw me, his face going pale as he realized what I'd found. I didn't need to say anything, he knew. He tried to reach for my hand, to start explaining, but I pulled back, feeling the betrayal press down on me, heavy and suffocating. The story came out slowly, reluctantly. They'd met through work, a simple connection that had turned into something else. He said it had just happened, that he'd never meant to hurt me. But nothing he said could change the fact that he'd betrayed me, that he'd looked me in the eye each day and chosen to lie. I asked him to leave that night. He packed a bag in silence, his head hung low, and when he finally walked out, I felt the weight of our shattered life settle around me. I sat there for hours, replaying every memory, every laugh, every moment of trust that now felt like a lie. I'd loved him with everything I had, and he'd torn that love apart in a way I couldn't have imagined. The next morning, I woke up alone for the first time in years. The house felt eerily quiet, each room a painful reminder of the life we'd shared, the future I'd believed in. Friends came by, calling, bringing food, sitting with me in the silence. I'd put on a brave face, but every time they left, I'd feel the raw ache return, a hollow emptiness that seemed to fill every corner of the house. But slowly, day by day, I began to rebuild. I focused on the little things, going for walks, reading, even rearranging the furniture, trying to make the space feel new, feel mine. I adopted a new routine, filling my time with things I'd always loved, but had set aside. Each small step felt like reclaiming a part of myself that I'd lost in our relationship. Months passed, and one day, I saw him again. I was at a cafe, and he was walking down the street, his head turned, laughing with a friend. He looked happy, almost carefree. And for a moment, my heart twisted, that old pain resurfacing. But as I watched him, I realized that he was no longer a part of my life, that he was a chapter I'd closed. I'd survived, found my way back to myself. And in that moment, I felt a sense of peace. I turned away, sipping my coffee, feeling lighter, as if I'd finally let go of the last lingering weight of our broken love. I'd found strength in the heartbreak, learned that I was whole on my own, complete without anyone else's validation. And as I left the cafe, walking into the quiet of the morning, I felt free, ready to embrace whatever came next with an open heart, knowing that I was strong enough to face it alone. A few winters ago, I took a seasonal job as a park ranger at a remote national park up north. It was a lonely assignment, but I didn't mind. The days were spent patrolling vast, snowy landscapes, and the nights, though cold and quiet, offered a peace you can only find in the middle of nowhere. There was just one other ranger at the station, an older guy named Bill, who'd been working there for nearly 2 decades. On one of my first nights there, I asked Bill about any strange things he'd seen during his time in the park, half joking, expecting some tall tales. But he just gave me a look, his eyes narrowing slightly, and said, "Stay out of the woods after dark. If you hear someone calling, ignore it." I laughed it off, thinking he was just trying to mess with the new guy, but something in his tone stayed with me. He didn't crack a smile, didn't look like he was joking. He just turned back to his paperwork, leaving me with an uneasy feeling. A few weeks passed, and everything was quiet. The occasional camper or hiker would wander through, but it was too cold and too remote for many visitors. One evening, as I was finishing up my rounds, I got a call on the radio from a woman who sounded lost. Her voice was faint, crackling through the static, but I could make out her words. "Help, please. I'm lost by the old lake." The old lake was about 3 miles into the woods, near a trail that wasn't even marked on the maps anymore. It was the dead of winter, and it would be nearly impossible to find your way out there alone. I radioed back, telling her to stay where she was, that I'd come find her. There was a pause. Then her voice crackled through again, soft and desperate. "Please hurry." I grabbed my gear, bundled up, and headed into the woods, my flashlight cutting through the thickening fog as I followed the narrow trail toward the lake. Snow crunched under my boots, the air cold and sharp. The forest was silent, the kind of silence that presses in on you, amplifying every little sound. About halfway to the lake, I called out, hoping she'd hear me. "Hello? Can you hear me? I'm coming." The only answer was the soft whisper of wind through the trees. I kept going, glancing back every so often, the distant glow of the ranger station fading behind me. The snow grew thicker, deeper, each step harder than the last. My flashlight barely cut through the fog, which seemed to be getting denser the closer I got to the lake. Then, just as I was beginning to wonder if I'd imagined the call, I heard it again. Her voice, faint but unmistakable, drifting through the trees. "Help, please." I quickened my pace, the sound of her voice getting clearer. But there was something odd about it now, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Her voice sounded the same as it had on the radio, the exact same tone, the same breathless, desperate whisper, like a recording on loop. "Hello?" I called out, shining my flashlight around, straining to see through the fog. Then, off to my left, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the lake. She was facing away from me, her silhouette barely visible in the fog, her shoulders hunched as if she were shivering. I felt a rush of relief and called out to her. "Hey, are you all right?" She didn't respond, didn't move, just stood there staring out over the lake. I started walking toward her, but as I got closer, I felt a strange heaviness in the air, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I stopped a few feet away, my flashlight illuminating her in a dim, eerie glow. "Miss," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Slowly, she turned to face me, and I felt my blood run cold. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and empty, her mouth slightly open as if frozen mid-scream. Her clothes were torn, covered in frost, her hair tangled and matted. But it was her eyes that held me in place, dark, hollow, like she was staring right through me. "Help," she whispered, her voice so faint it was almost drowned out by the wind. I took a step back, every instinct screaming at me to turn and run. But I couldn't move, couldn't look away from her empty, lifeless gaze. And then she took a step forward, her movements jerky, unnatural, as if she were being pulled by invisible strings. I stumbled back, my flashlight shaking in my hand as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Who are you?" She didn't answer, just took another step forward, her mouth opening wider, her face contorting into an expression of sheer terror. And then, in a voice that was somehow both hers and not hers, she whispered, "Don't let it take me." With that, she faded into the fog, her figure dissolving like smoke, leaving me alone in the silence of the forest. I turned and ran, not caring if I tripped, not caring if I got lost, just desperate to put as much distance between me and that place as possible. I burst out of the woods and stumbled back into the ranger station, gasping for breath, my heart racing. Bill looked up from his desk, taking one look at my face and shaking his head slowly. "You went to the lake, didn't you?" he said quietly. I nodded, still catching my breath. There was someone there, a woman. She asked for help. Bill sighed, his expression grim. "You're not the first to see her. They say she got lost out there one winter years ago. Called for help, but no one came in time. By the time they found her," he trailed off, his eyes distant. "She didn't make it?" I asked, barely able to get the words out. Bill shook his head. "They found her by the lake, frozen, eyes wide open like she was staring at something. And every winter, some poor soul hears her voice, calling for help. But whatever you do," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "don't follow it. Because once you hear her call, she'll keep coming back, waiting for someone to take her place." I never went back to the lake after dark. And to this day, every time the winter fog rolls in, I can still hear her voice, faint and distant, whispering through the trees. "Help, please don't let it take me." I don't know if I'll ever make sense of what happened this past spring. It's one of those things that's so strange, so specific, that even I can't decide if it was real or if my mind was playing tricks on me. But I swear, every detail is as clear to me now as the night it happened. I've been doing part-time work as a caretaker for an old, historic theater downtown. It wasn't much, just a few nights a week, locking up after shows, doing some light cleaning, keeping an eye on things until the place was empty. The theater had been there for over a century. A beautiful but aging place with rows of velvet seats, ornate carvings along the walls, and huge, heavy red curtains that had to be drawn by hand. I'd walk through those empty halls late at night, listening to the echoes of 100 years of performances, footsteps, applause, laughter. It was almost peaceful. Most nights were the same routine. Check the lights, lock the doors, walk the aisles to make sure no one had left anything behind. I'd go up to the projection booth, run some final checks, and then lock up for the night. But one Friday night, just after the last show had ended and everyone had filed out, something felt different. I'd been mopping the floors in the main hall when I heard a soft creak coming from the stage. I looked up, expecting to see one of the crew members grabbing something they'd left behind, but the theater was empty, the stage dimly lit by the faint glow of the exit lights. I walked up the aisle, the mop still in my hand, and called out, "Hello?" But there was no answer. The only sound was the faint hum of the old theater lights buzzing overhead. As I stood there, looking up at the stage, I noticed something strange. The curtain, the heavy red one that covered the entire length of the stage, was swaying slightly, as if there was a draft coming from somewhere. I tried to shrug it off, assuming it was just the old building settling, or maybe a breeze from one of the back exits. I turned back to my cleaning, finishing up the last row of seats. But as I worked, I kept catching something out of the corner of my eye, a flicker of movement, a shadow that seemed to flit across the stage, just beyond the curtain's edge. By the time I finished, it was past midnight, and I was exhausted. I decided to do one last check and head out. I grabbed my things and went up to the projection booth, checking that all the equipment was off, that everything was in order. I was about to lock the door when I saw it again, a faint shadow moving across the stage, drifting slowly from left to right. This time, I couldn't ignore it. I went back down, walking to the stage, my heart pounding as I approached the curtain. I felt a strange pull, an urge to look behind it, even though every instinct was telling me to just leave, to lock up and go home. I reached out and grabbed the thick fabric, pulling it back slowly, and that's when I saw her. She was standing in the middle of the stage, facing away from me. She was dressed in a long, flowing gown, the kind you'd see in old movies, her hair pulled back in a loose bun. She looked almost out of place, like she belonged to another time. For a second, I thought she was an actress who'd somehow gotten locked in, or maybe a member of the crew in costume. But as I opened my mouth to call out to her, she turned, and I felt a chill wash over me. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes had this faraway, haunted look, like she was staring straight through me. She didn't say anything, didn't move, just watched me with this expression that was somewhere between sadness and anger. I stood there, frozen, unable to look away. And then, slowly, she lifted her hand and pointed to something on the ground, just beside her. I looked down, following her gesture, and saw a small object lying on the floor, a locket, old and tarnished, with a thin chain that had twisted around itself. It looked out of place, like it had been there for years, gathering dust in the shadows. I took a step back, my heart pounding, and when I looked up again, she was gone. Just gone, as if she'd never been there at all. I looked around, half expecting her to reappear, but the stage was empty, the theater silent. I knelt down, picking up the locket with trembling fingers. It was cool to the touch, and as I turned it over, I felt a strange sense of familiarity, like I'd seen it somewhere before. I opened it, and inside was a faded photograph, a woman dressed exactly like the figure I'd seen on the stage. Her face was younger, softer, but it was her, down to the haunted look in her eyes. I don't know why, but I put the locket in my pocket, telling myself I'd take it to the theater manager the next day, try to find out who it belonged to. I locked up quickly, practically running out of the building, desperate to get away from the heavy silence pressing in around me. The next morning, I went to the manager's office and told him what I'd seen, showing him the locket, hoping he'd laugh it off, tell me it was just a prop, something left over from a show. But when he saw it, his face went pale. That belonged to Alice Rivers, he said slowly, barely above a whisper. She was one of the actresses here, back in the 30s. She died here. Fell from the rafters during a performance. Some people say she still wanders around, looking for something she lost. He looked at the locket, his hand shaking slightly, and then handed it back to me. No one's seen that locket in years, he murmured. It vanished after she died. People said it was buried with her. I didn't know what to say, couldn't wrap my mind around what he was telling me. I left the office, feeling a strange, heavy weight in my pocket where the locket rested, like it was anchoring me to something I couldn't understand. That night, I went back to the theater, even though I didn't have a shift. I don't know why, but I felt drawn to the place, like there was something I needed to do. I stood on the empty stage, holding the locket in my hand, feeling the silence settle around me. And then, for the last time, I saw her. She was standing in the wings, watching me, her face soft, almost grateful. I held up the locket, and she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, her figure growing fainter, as if she was fading back into the shadows. I left the locket on the stage that night, placing it in the exact spot where I'd found it. And as I walked away, I felt a strange sense of peace, like something that had been trapped for years had finally found its way home. I don't work at the theater anymore, but sometimes when I pass by, I feel her presence, a gentle, lingering warmth, as if she's still there, watching over the place she loved. And every now and then, I catch a faint flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow slipping through the empty rows, and I wonder if she's finally at peace, or if she's still waiting, watching, holding on to her memories in the quiet, hidden spaces of the theater. Last fall, I moved into an old, creaky house just on the edge of town. It was one of those places that felt like it had 1,000 stories hidden in its walls. It was cheap with more space than I needed, and the landlord mentioned it hadn't been lived in for years, but I didn't care. I was just happy to have my own place. The first few nights were uneventful, save for the usual settling noises of an old house. The pipes groaned, the floors creaked, and sometimes I'd hear the faint sounds of branches tapping against the windows. But one night, just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard something new. It was a low, steady knock like someone was tapping on the wall just outside my bedroom. It came in slow, measured beats, each knock louder than the last. I sat up, listening, telling myself it was just the house settling. But then the knocks came again, this time from the opposite side of the room, as if whatever it was had moved down the hallway. I got out of bed, heart pounding, and opened my bedroom door. The hallway was dark, shadows pooling into corners, the silence stretching out in that thick, oppressive way that makes you hold your breath. I flicked on the hallway light, but nothing seemed out of place. Just empty walls, old carpet, and the faint scent of dust. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was nothing, and went back to bed. But just as I started drifting off, the knocks returned, louder and more insistent. This time right next to my bed, as if they were coming from the wall beside me. I jolted awake, staring at the wall, feeling the vibrations through the bed frame. The knocking didn't stop, just kept going, each beat more forceful, until it felt like the wall itself was pulsing, like something was trying to break through. I could feel a chill creeping up my spine, a heavy feeling settling in my chest. The knocks suddenly stopped, and the silence that followed was even worse. I lay there, heart racing, listening to my own ragged breaths, half expecting something to emerge from the wall. But there was nothing, just the quiet hum of the house, as if it were holding its breath. Over the next few nights, the knocking continued, always at random times, always coming from different parts of the house. Sometimes it was down the hall, other times in the living room, but it always came closer and closer to my bedroom until I started dreading bedtime. One night, after hours of listening to that relentless knocking, I decided I'd had enough. Armed with a flashlight, I got out of bed and followed the sound down the hallway, determined to find the source. The knocks led me to the basement door, an old, wooden door that I'd barely noticed before. It was partially open, and I could feel a draft coming from the darkness below. With a deep breath, I pulled the door open wider, shining my flashlight down the narrow staircase. The basement was pitch black, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, something metallic and stale. I stepped down, each step creaking under my weight, the light barely piercing the shadows. Halfway down, I noticed something strange. The walls of the staircase had scratch marks, deep grooves carved into the wood as if someone had dragged their nails down the length of it. I stopped, the hair on the back of my neck standing up, but something compelled me to keep going, to find the source of the knocks. At the bottom of the stairs, I found myself in a small, cramped space, filled with old, forgotten things, boxes, broken furniture, and thick cobwebs draping from the ceiling. I scanned the room, the flashlight casting eerie shadows that seemed to move as I passed them. And then, in the far corner of the room, I saw it, a door. It was smaller than a normal door, almost hidden behind a stack of old crates, the wood warped and splintered. I don't know what possessed me to go closer, but I felt drawn to it, like it was calling me. I moved the crates aside, shining my flashlight on the door. The knocks started again, louder than ever, coming from just beyond the door. I froze, every instinct telling me to turn back, to leave and never come back. But I reached out, my hand trembling, and touched the doorknob. It was ice cold, sending a jolt up my arm. I turned it slowly, the door creaking as it swung open, revealing a narrow crawl space lined with stone walls. Inside, in the dim glow of my flashlight, I could just make out the outline of a figure, a woman, hunched and facing the wall, her hair hanging in long, matted strands, her hands pressed against the stone as if trying to claw her way through. I gasped, stumbling back, but she didn't move, didn't turn, just kept scratching at the wall with fingers that were raw and bloody. The knocking grew louder, coming from all around me, echoing through the basement, filling the space with a sound that seemed to vibrate through my bones. The woman's hands paused, her head tilting slowly, and then, as if sensing me, she began to turn. I bolted, racing up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind me. I barely slept that night, every creak and groan of the house filling me with dread. The next morning, I called the landlord, demanding to know more about the house, about its history. He was quiet for a moment, and then he sighed. "I didn't want to scare you," he said slowly. "But the last tenant, she disappeared. She lived there alone, said she kept hearing knocking in the walls. She called me a few times, frantic, but by the time I went to check on her, she was gone. The police never found her. I moved out that week, leaving most of my things behind, unable to bear the thought of stepping back into that house. But even now, I can still hear it sometimes, that relentless knocking, coming from just beyond the walls, like someone trying to break through, trapped in a place no one should ever go. I wasn't supposed to be working that night. I'd swapped shifts with another nurse at the last minute, and looking back, I wish I hadn't. It was the overnight shift at a small hospital in a quiet, rural town, the kind of place where nothing ever seemed to happen. By midnight, the halls were dark and empty, most of the patients fast asleep, the silence broken only by the steady hum of machines. It was peaceful in a way, a welcome break from the hectic pace of the day's shifts. Around 2 a.m., I was doing my rounds when I heard it, the faint metallic creak of a wheelchair rolling down the hall. The sound stopped me in my tracks because I knew all our patients were either asleep or confined to their beds. I listened for a moment, expecting it to stop, but the creak continued, slow and deliberate, moving down the corridor. I walked toward the sound, expecting to find a patient who'd gotten confused and wandered off. But as I rounded the corner, the hallway was empty. Just the faint, fading echoes of wheels on tile. I told myself it was just the pipes or the old ventilation system acting up again. This hospital was known for its quirks, so it wasn't unusual to hear strange noises in the middle of the night. But as I turned to go back to my station, I saw something that made me stop. One of the room doors was slightly ajar, room 209, which I was certain I'd closed after my last check. I hesitated, feeling a strange, creeping unease. Room 209 was empty, reserved for overflow patients we never seemed to get, and I knew it had been locked earlier. I stood there, heart pounding, staring at the open door, telling myself it was just a draft or maybe a careless mistake. But a part of me felt that something was very, very wrong. I stepped inside, flipping on the light, and found the room exactly as I'd left it. Neatly made bed, empty bedside table, untouched equipment. I almost laughed at myself, ready to chalk it up to paranoia, when I noticed something odd. There was an imprint on the bed, a clear, unmistakable indentation, as if someone had been lying there, the sheets slightly crumpled. But the bed had been untouched all night. No one was assigned to this room. I took a step back, feeling my skin prickle, and that's when I noticed it, a faint, cold draft like a breath on the back of my neck. I turned, instinctively, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the room was empty. Just the dim light, the cold air, and that feeling of being watched. I shut the door, trying to shake off the chill that had settled over me, and went back to my rounds. But the rest of the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that I wasn't alone in those dark, quiet halls. The next night, I was scheduled again. By now, the strange experience from the night before felt like a half-forgotten dream, something I could brush off as exhaustion. But halfway through my shift, the noises started again. First, the soft creak of a wheelchair moving down the hall. Then, faint footsteps, almost inaudible, like someone trying to avoid being heard. I walked down the hallway, shining my flashlight, but as before, there was nothing. Just the empty halls, stretching into darkness. As I turned to go back, I heard a door creak open behind me. I whipped around, heart pounding, and saw the door to room 209 slowly swinging open. The lights inside flickered, casting strange, shifting shadows across the walls. I don't know why I went in. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that there was nothing to be afraid of, that I was letting my mind play tricks on me. But as soon as I stepped inside, I felt it again. That cold, suffocating presence, like someone was standing just inches away, watching me. The bed was empty, but there was something on the pillow, something that hadn't been there the night before. A small, white hospital bracelet, frayed and yellowed with age. I picked it up, my hands shaking, and read the name printed on it, Helen Graves. The name didn't mean anything to me, but a chill ran down my spine as I realized that I'd never seen this bracelet before. It looked old, like it had been sitting in storage for years. The ink faded, the plastic cracked. I put it back on the bed, feeling like I was intruding on something I didn't understand, and backed out of the room, closing the door behind me. The rest of the night passed in a blur, every shadow and sound sending jolts of fear through me. I couldn't get the image of that hospital bracelet out of my mind, that name, Helen Graves, echoing in my head. The next day, I went to the hospital archives, hoping to find some information, maybe a record of a former patient. I found a box of old files, dust-covered and forgotten, and started sifting through them. After an hour, I found a file from 1958 detailing the death of a patient named Helen Graves. According to the records, Helen had been a long-term patient, admitted after a severe stroke. She'd spent the last months of her life in room 209, paralyzed and alone, unable to communicate, with only the occasional visit from the hospital staff. She died in that room, and for some reason, her bracelet had never been removed, her file never properly closed. I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence, that the bracelet had somehow been misplaced and ended up in the room. But deep down, I knew there was something more. That night, I was on edge, every sound and shadow filling me with a sense of dread I couldn't shake. Around 3 a.m., as I was finishing my rounds, I heard it again, the soft creak of a wheelchair, followed by the faint sound of labored breathing. It was coming from room 209. I walked down the hall, my footsteps echoing, and stopped in front of the door. It was open, just a crack, and I could see the dim outline of the bed, the empty chair beside it, and something else, a figure, barely visible, lying on the bed. I stepped inside, heart pounding, and as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw her. An old woman, lying perfectly still, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes closed, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. She looked just like the photo in the file, the same hollow cheeks, the same sunken eyes. And then, slowly, her eyes opened. They fixed on me, empty and unseeing, yet filled with a kind of sadness that pierced me to my core. Her mouth opened, as if to speak, but no sound came out. She just lay there, staring at me, her eyes pleading, filled with a desperation I couldn't understand. I backed out of the room, too afraid to turn my back on her, and ran down the hall, not stopping until I was outside, gasping for air. I quit the next day, told my supervisor that I couldn't do it anymore. I didn't tell her why. I didn't think she'd believe me. But even now, I can't get her face out of my mind. Those empty eyes, the silent plea, the faint sound of that wheelchair creaking down the hall. It was a rainy Saturday when the letter arrived, tucked under my door like it had been slipped there by someone in a hurry. I picked it up, surprised, since I hadn't received a handwritten letter in years. The envelope was plain, with my name written in careful cursive on the front. No address, no return label. I turned it over and noticed a strange symbol stamped in dark red wax on the back. A compass rose with a tiny heart at its center. Curious, I broke the seal and unfolded the letter. The paper was soft, almost velvety, and the ink had a faint, sweet scent, like old roses. The message was short and mysterious. Dear Alex, if you found this letter, it's time to remember what you left behind. Tomorrow at midnight, come to the West Haven Clock Tower. Bring only your courage. All my love, the one who waits. I read it over 3 or 4 times, my mind racing. The clock tower? I hadn't been there in years. And the one who waits? I had no idea who that could be. My life was quiet, predictable, filled with work and routines. Nothing like the letter seemed to imply. But something about it drew me in, a whisper of mystery, of adventure, and maybe of something I've forgotten. So, the next night, I found myself standing at the base of the old clock tower as midnight approached, the rain coming down in a soft drizzle. The tower was an ancient relic, long abandoned, with ivy creeping up the sides and windows that were more glass shards than panes. I'd only been up there once before, years ago, on a dare with friends. That night had faded to a hazy memory, just another thrill from a time when everything felt more alive. But here I was again, drawn back by this strange invitation. I pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside, the scent of dust and damp stone filling the air. The only light came from the moon filtering through the cracked windows, casting strange shadows across the spiral staircase that wound up into darkness. With a deep breath, I started up the stairs, each step creaking beneath my weight. The climb was longer than I remembered, or maybe it just felt that way, because my heart was pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement. I reached the top and pushed open the door to the clock room. Inside, the room was empty, save for the huge, ancient clock face on the far wall, its hands frozen at midnight. But there, in the center of the room, was a small table with an object resting on it, a compass, old and slightly tarnished, with the same rose and heart symbol engraved on its lid. Next to the compass was another note, written in the same familiar handwriting. "Alex, it's been a long time, hasn't it? I've been waiting here, keeping watch, holding on to what you left behind. You've lived a careful life, but I know there's still a spark in you. Open the compass and let it guide you back to what you lost." The word struck something deep inside me. It was as though the letter knew me, understood the careful life I'd built, the routines that had filled my days but left something hollow in my heart. With trembling hands, I picked up the compass and opened it. Instead of a needle, the compass held a small, delicate piece of paper, folded neatly and yellowed with age. I carefully unfolded it and felt my breath catch. It was a drawing, one I remembered making when I was 17. It showed the view from the top of the clock tower on the night I'd climbed up here with friends, a cityscape filled with stars and moonlight, and in the corner, I'd scrawled a tiny heart with my initials and those of my best friend, Emily. Emily. Memories flooded back. Her laughter, her endless sense of adventure, the nights we'd spent dreaming up wild plans. Both of us convinced we'd conquer the world together. But life had taken us down different paths, and over the years, we'd drifted apart. I hadn't thought about that night in years, or the promises we'd made, or the dreams we'd had. Beneath the drawing, written in that same familiar script, was one final message. Sometimes, the things we leave behind are waiting for us to come back to them. Find me where the stars meet the water. I knew exactly where that was. Our secret spot, just outside of town, where the river bent and opened up to a wide, clear pool. We'd called it Star Water because at night, the reflection of the sky made it look like you were floating in the stars. It had been our favorite place, the place where we talked about everything, our fears, our dreams, the things we never told anyone else. Without another thought, I left the clock tower, the compass still clutched tightly in my hand. The rain had stopped, and the night was calm, the streets empty as I made my way out of town, following the road that led to the river. When I reached the edge of Starwater, I saw her. Emily was standing by the water, her back to me, looking out over the river as if she'd been waiting there forever. She turned as I approached, and when she saw me, she smiled, that same familiar, mischievous smile that had once been my whole world. "Alex," she said softly, like she was testing the sound of my name. "Emily," I replied, feeling like I was standing on the edge of something huge and life-changing. We stood there for a moment, just looking at each other, both of us caught between the person we'd been and the person we'd become. Finally, she broke the silence. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she admitted, her voice tinged with a vulnerability I hadn't heard in years. "I wasn't sure I would either," I replied. "But I think I've been waiting for this for a long time." She nodded, understanding. "I sent the letter because, well, I needed to know if you remembered. If you still felt that spark, that sense of adventure we used to talk about." I looked down at the compass in my hand, its weight both familiar and foreign. "I remember, and I think I lost it somewhere along the way." Emily stepped closer, reaching out to touch the compass, her fingers brushing against mine. "Maybe we both did, but we're here now, and maybe that's enough." We stood there, side by side, watching the stars reflected in the water, feeling the weight of years of silence lift between us. The compass, still warm in my hand, seemed to hum with a quiet energy, like it was waiting for us to make the first move. "I missed this," I said softly. "I missed us." "Me too," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "I think a part of me has always been waiting here, hoping you'd come back." We spent the rest of the night talking, laughing, and rediscovering the pieces of ourselves we'd left behind. And as dawn broke, painting the river in soft hues of pink and gold, I knew that I'd found something priceless, something I hadn't even realized I'd been searching for. The compass had led me back to Emily, but more than that, it had led me back to myself. The version of me who still believed in adventure, in wonder, and in the magic of the unexpected. As we walked back to town, Emily and I made a promise, like we'd done so many years ago. But this time, it wasn't a promise to chase wild dreams or conquer the world. It was simpler, quieter, a promise to remember, to never let go of the things that mattered, the people who shaped us, and the parts of ourselves we'd almost forgotten. And somehow, I knew that, no matter where life took us, we'd always find our way back here, to each other, and to the stars reflected on the water. This happened about a year ago, and I'm still not sure if I can explain it in a way that does it justice. I don't talk about it much because it sounds too strange to believe, but it's been weighing on me ever since like an itch I can't scratch. I was working a night shift as a security guard at a small museum in a quiet part of town. It wasn't a big place, mostly local history displays, artifacts from the town's past, some old tools, black and white photographs, and a few rooms with artwork from local artists. During the day, the museum had a handful of visitors, mostly older folks or families with kids. But at night, it was just me and the empty halls. I'd walk the building every hour, checking the exhibits, making sure the alarms were set. It was usually silent, just the faint hum of the HVAC system and the occasional creak of the old floors. I'd gotten used to the sounds and the shadows. But one night, in late autumn, something felt off. It was around 2 a.m., and I was doing my usual rounds. I was in the wing with the historical artifacts, just going through my checklist when I heard a faint tapping sound. It was rhythmic, like someone gently knocking on glass. I stopped, listening, thinking maybe a tree branch was brushing up against one of the windows outside. But then I remembered that there weren't any trees near this part of the building. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate, echoing down the hall. I followed the sound, my flashlight cutting through the shadows. It seemed to be coming from one of the older exhibits, a collection of artifacts from a fire that had destroyed half the town back in the 1920s. There was a case with items recovered from the wreckage, charred toys, melted coins, fragments of letters. The centerpiece of the display was an old mirror, cracked and smoke-stained, the glass fogged over with age. The tapping was coming from that mirror. I stared at it, feeling my skin crawl. I'd walked past that mirror hundreds of times, but I'd never paid it much attention. It was just another item in the display, something meant to fill space. But now, standing in front of it, I felt this heavy sense of dread, like the air around me had thickened. I took a step closer, shining my flashlight onto the glass, and that's when I saw it, a faint outline just barely visible in the reflection. It looked like a face, but it was distorted, twisted, like it was pressing up against the other side of the glass, struggling to get through. I blinked, thinking it had to be a trick of the light, but the face didn't disappear. Instead, it seemed to grow clearer, the features sharpening until I could make out the hollow eyes, the thin, sunken cheeks. And then, before I could react, the face moved. Its mouth opened, twisting into a silent scream, and the tapping grew louder, more frantic, like it was trying to break through. I stumbled back, my heart pounding, and the light flickered, casting strange shadows across the walls. I wanted to run, to get as far away from that mirror as possible, but something kept me rooted to the spot, like I was trapped in a nightmare, unable to wake up. The tapping stopped suddenly, and for a moment, the room was silent, the air thick with a strange, oppressive energy. And then, slowly, words began to appear on the surface of the mirror, scratched into the fogged glass from the inside. "Find me." The words were thin, barely visible, but they sent a chill down my spine. I backed away, almost tripping over my own feet, and then I turned and ran, stumbling down the hall until I reached the office. I locked the door, sat down, and tried to calm my breathing, telling myself that it was just my imagination, that I'd let the darkness get to me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something in that mirror, something trapped, waiting. The rest of the night passed in a blur, and by the time my shift ended, I was practically sprinting out of the building. I didn't tell anyone about what I'd seen. I knew how it would sound. But the words on the mirror stayed with me, haunting me, pulling at the edges of my mind. Over the next few weeks, I started doing some research, looking up everything I could find about the museum and the fire that had destroyed the town. I found an old newspaper article about a woman named Lillian Hargrove, a teacher who had died in the fire. According to the story, she'd been trapped inside her classroom, unable to escape as the flames spread. They never found her body, just a few personal items, including the mirror. I don't know what I was hoping to find, but something about her story made me feel connected, like she was reaching out, asking for help. I went back to the museum during the day when the place felt less menacing and asked the curator about the mirror. He looked at me, surprised, and said, "Funny you ask about that. It was one of the few things recovered from the schoolhouse. They say it was the last thing she looked into before she. That night, I returned to the museum for my shift, determined to go back to the mirror to see if I could find any trace of the words I'd seen. I walked the halls, my flashlight casting long shadows, and when I reached the display, I felt a strange sense of calm. The mirror was there, silent, the surface dark and still. I leaned in, looking closely, searching for any sign of the scratches, but there was nothing, just my own reflection staring back at me, my face pale in the dim light. And then, as I turned to walk away, I heard it again. The tapping. Slow, steady, coming from the mirror. The sound echoing through the empty hall. I left the museum that night and never went back. I told my manager I couldn't do it anymore, that I needed a change, and I found another job in a different part of town. But even now, months later, I still hear the tapping sometimes, late at night when everything is quiet. It echoes through the silence, faint but insistent, like someone calling from far away. And every time I hear it, I see those words in my mind scratched into the glass. Find me. And I wonder if Lillian is still there, waiting, searching for someone who can finally set her free. This happened just last winter, and no matter how hard I try, I can't shake it. I don't know if I ever will. I just moved to a small town for a fresh start. It was one of those places that felt like time had forgotten. Old, narrow streets, dark woods encircling the town, and locals who'd known each other since they were kids. My new job was at a little bookstore off the main road, a cozy, dusty place that seemed as old as the town itself. The owner was a kind, quiet man named Tom, who looked like he hadn't had a full night's sleep in years. He hired me almost on the spot when I applied, even though I didn't have any retail experience. The bookstore had a small upstairs apartment, and Tom offered it to me for cheap rent as part of my pay. It was a bit run down, peeling wallpaper, creaky floors, a faint smell of mildew. But I was in no position to be picky. I thought it would be a quiet place where I could read, write, and just exist without anyone bothering me. The first few weeks were peaceful. The bookstore had its regulars, mostly older folks who liked to chat with Tom or browse the dusty shelves. There was a sense of comfort in the quiet routine, but about a month in, I noticed something strange. Every morning when I'd open the shop, I'd find books lying on the floor, always in the same section, always the same few books. I figured it was just the old shelving or drafts from the poorly insulated walls. But after I'd put the books back, they'd be on the floor again the next morning. The same titles, over and over. One night, as I was closing up, Tom noticed me picking up the books. "Let them be," he murmured, almost to himself. His voice was low, barely more than a whisper. "It's best not to interfere." I asked him what he meant, but he just shook his head, a tight, nervous look in his eyes. He left without explaining, leaving me alone in the shop, staring at the scattered books. That night, I lay awake in the tiny upstairs apartment, feeling uneasy. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and every little creak of the old building felt louder, sharper. I kept thinking about Tom's words, about the strange way he'd looked at me, like he knew something he wasn't telling me. Around midnight, just as I was drifting off, I heard a noise from downstairs. A faint, rhythmic thumping, like something heavy shifting on the shelves. I sat up, straining to hear, every muscle tense. Then the sound stopped, replaced by a faint, shuffling movement, as if someone was walking slowly through the store. I tried to brush it off as my imagination, but the noises continued, growing louder and more distinct. A scrape here, a soft thud there. The creak of the floorboards just beneath my bed. I forced myself to lie still, telling myself it was the wind, just the old building settling. But then, just as I was about to get up and check, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A whisper, faint and raspy, coming from the floor beneath me. "Leave it alone." I froze, my heart pounding, every nerve on fire. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as I strained to hear, holding my breath, waiting for more. But the whisper faded, and the silence pressed down on me like a weight. The next morning, I went downstairs and found the books scattered across the floor again, the same titles as always, lying open as if someone had been flipping through them. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting Tom to be there, watching, but I was alone. I picked up the books, carefully stacking them on the counter, and that's when I noticed something strange. One of the books, a thick, worn leather volume, had a name scrawled in the margin of one of the pages. The ink was faded, barely legible, but it looked like the name Sarah. And beside it, written in smaller, neater handwriting, was a date. December 16th, 1949. The name and date meant nothing to me, but I felt a chill run down my spine. I flipped through the book, but the rest of it was empty, the pages yellowed with age. I set it back on the shelf, feeling unsettled. That night, the noises started again. The soft thumping, the faint shuffling footsteps, the creak of floorboards. I lay in bed, clutching the covers, too afraid to move. But just as I thought it might stop, I heard the whisper again, louder this time, more insistent. "Leave it alone." I shot out of bed, throwing on my robe, determined to confront whatever, or whoever, was in the shop. I crept down the stairs, flashlight in hand, my pulse racing. The air felt thick, heavy, like I was wading through something dense and unseen. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I saw a shadow flicker across the room, vanishing behind one of the shelves. "Hello!" I called out, my voice shaking. "Who's there?" There was no answer, just the soft rustle of paper as one of the books fell to the floor, landing with a thud. I walked over, heart pounding, and picked it up. It was the same book with Sarah's name inside, lying open to the same page, her name almost glowing in the dim light. And then, behind me, I heard it, a soft, slow breathing, so close I could feel it on the back of my neck. I spun around, but the store was empty. Just rows of dusty shelves, the faint glow of my flashlight casting long shadows. I backed away, my hands shaking, clutching the book to my chest. I wanted to leave, to run, but something held me there, a morbid curiosity mixed with a fear so deep it felt like it was rooted in my bones. The breathing grew louder, more insistent, until it filled the room, pressing in from all sides. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped, leaving a thick silence that seemed to swallow the air. I backed out of the store, locking the door behind me, and didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I found Tom waiting outside, looking tired and pale. He didn't say anything, just nodded at me, as if he understood. He held out his hand, and I handed him the book with Sarah's name. He looked down at it, his expression unreadable, then slipped it into his coat pocket. "Some things," he said quietly, "are best left alone." I never asked him who Sarah was. I didn't want to know. But every night after that, I'd hear her name in my dreams, whispered softly, like she was still somewhere in that shop, waiting, watching, asking for something no one could give her. A month later, I quit the job, packed my things, and left that town behind. But even now, late at night, I sometimes hear it. The soft creak of floorboards, the faint rustle of pages, and that same insistent whisper. "Leave it alone." He'd always been the quiet type, steady and thoughtful, the kind of person who'd remember the smallest details, like how I took my coffee or the exact way I liked my eggs. We'd been together for nearly 7 years, and our lives felt like they fit together in an unbreakable rhythm. We were a unit, a team, and in my heart, I'd already planned our future. Weddings, kids, growing old side by side. So when things started to shift, it felt almost imperceptible, like a barely there change in the air. At first, it was the small stuff, little habits that seemed to appear out of nowhere. He'd always been an open book, leaving his phone around, unlocked and untouched. But then he started keeping it in his pocket or turning it face down on the table. I thought maybe I was just imagining things, that he was being cautious or polite, so I brushed it off. You don't question someone you trust with your whole heart, right? Then he began working late more often, which he'd never had to do before. He'd text me just before I started dinner, saying he'd be home by 9, maybe 10. He'd walk in, exhausted and distracted, muttering something vague about team stuff. I'd try to cheer him up, to reconnect, to keep our routines going, but he'd just smile in this hollow way that didn't reach his eyes. I missed the way he used to wrap me in a bear hug as soon as he walked through the door, and how we'd end every evening by talking about our day. One Friday night, he said he'd be out with a few coworkers for drinks, a quick celebration after a big project. I was happy for him, proud. Even so, I decided to surprise him. I texted him around 9 p.m., asking if he wanted me to meet up, maybe grab dinner afterward. But he didn't reply, not for hours. Midnight rolled around, then 1 in the morning. I waited up, my mind spiraling with worry and strange thoughts I couldn't silence. Finally, he came home, smelling faintly of perfume, his shirt wrinkled in a way that didn't match his usual meticulous look. I asked him where he'd been, my voice wavering in a way I couldn't control. He shrugged, laughing it off, saying the bar had been crowded and he'd lost track of time. But there was something off in his voice, a guarded tone that felt like a wall between us. After that night, I felt a shift in myself, a creeping suspicion that became impossible to ignore. I tried to reason with it, to tell myself that it was all in my head, that he was just stressed or tired. But each time he glanced at his phone, each late-night text, every missed call or vague explanation, it chipped away at my trust, little by little. One evening, he left his laptop open while he went to take a shower. I stood there, staring at it, feeling torn between wanting to trust him and an ache that demanded answers. I told myself not to look, that I was just being paranoid, but something inside me wouldn't let it go, wouldn't let me just walk away. So, I clicked on his messages, my hands shaking as I scrolled, feeling my heart pound with each word I read. There it was, a name I didn't recognize. Someone named M. Their messages were filled with flirtation, little secrets, even inside jokes that I didn't understand. My chest tightened as I read through weeks of conversations, plans to meet up, details about their evenings, confessions that he'd never shared with me. And there, at the bottom of the screen, a message that took my breath away. I wish I could spend the night with you. When he came out of the shower, I was sitting on the bed, his laptop open beside me. He froze when he saw my face, his expression crumbling as he realized what I'd seen. I didn't say anything at first, just looked at him, my heart breaking in slow motion. He tried to reach for me, to explain, but I pulled back, feeling the betrayal sink in, deeper than I thought was possible. He stumbled through his excuses, saying it wasn't serious, that it had just happened. But his words felt empty, like echoes bouncing around in a hollow space. I asked him why, my voice barely a whisper, but he couldn't answer, just kept saying he was sorry, that he hadn't meant to hurt me. But every apology only drove the hurt deeper, relentless ache that wouldn't go away. I told him to leave that night. He tried to stay, begged me for another chance, swearing he'd never see her again. But I couldn't bear to look at him, couldn't stand the thought of living in the same space where he'd built his lies. I watched as he packed a bag, his face etched with guilt and regret. When the door closed behind him, I felt the silence rush in, a crushing weight that filled every corner of the room. In the days that followed, I felt numb, as if I were moving through a fog. Friends reached out, calling and texting, trying to offer support, but their words felt distant, unable to touch the depth of my pain. I'd built my life around him, trusted him with everything, and now it all felt like a cruel joke. I tried to fill the empty spaces, packing away his things, erasing the traces of him from our home. But everywhere I looked, I saw memories that felt broken, tainted. But slowly, day by day, I found my way back to myself. I started going on long walks, taking time to read, reconnecting with friends I hadn't seen in months. I redecorated the apartment, painted the walls, added plants, filled the space with things that made me feel whole. Each small change felt like reclaiming a piece of myself, like building a new life from the ashes of what I'd lost. Months passed, and one day, he showed up at my door. He looked different, worn, his eyes filled with regret. He asked if we could talk, if he could make things right. Part of me wanted to let him in, to hear him out, to find some kind of closure. But as I looked at him, I realized I didn't need his apology or his explanations. I'd already found my own peace, my own closure. I told him goodbye, a real goodbye, one that left no room for going back. I watched him walk away, feeling lighter, as if I'd finally let go of the last pieces of hurt and betrayal. I had survived, and in the process, I discovered a strength I hadn't known I possessed. I'd learned that my worth wasn't tied to anyone else's choices, that I was whole on my own. Now, I carry the scars, but they don't hurt anymore. They're reminders of the love I gave, of the lessons I learned, of the resilience I found in myself. And as I move forward, I know that I am ready for whatever comes next, knowing that I am enough just as I am,